My son-in-law invited everyone to a lavish villa in Paris except me. He announced at dinner that they only had enough budget for the two of them and his parents. My own daughter leaned across the table and added that they desperately needed a break from me because my constant presence was simply too depressing. I did not shout or argue. I just smiled calmly and wished them a highly enjoyable trip. When they finally arrived at the magnificent villa in France, I was already there waiting for them. I was not standing in the foyer as a guest. I was waiting for them as the host of the estate. Before I continue this incredible story, let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Malcolm. I am 70 years old. I live in a sparse, quiet annex attached to a sprawling suburban estate. Tonight I sat at the far end of a massive oak dining table eating a simple meal of roasted chicken and greens I had prepared for myself. The main event was happening at the center of the expansive room. My son-in-law, Bradley, sat at the head of the table. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit that perfectly contrasted with his pale skin, projecting an aura of old money and aggressive corporate dominance. His manicured hands clutched a crystal wine glass with an air of absolute entitlement. Beside him sat my daughter Jocelyn, draped in expensive emerald silk, laughing loudly at a joke made by Bradley's parents. They were a boisterous group, entirely absorbed in their own manufactured grandiosity. I was merely a silent shadow at the edge of their brilliant light. They allowed me to dine with them on Sunday evenings, an act of performative charity that Bradley insisted upon to make himself feel remarkably magnanimous. I kept my head down. I focused intensely on my plain white plate. I observed every single dynamic in the room. I looked at my own hands resting quietly on the edge of the polished wood. They were heavily calloused, thick with muscle, and scarred from decades of unforgiving manual labor. Camille and I had built our immense real estate empire brick by brick, starting with nothing but raw ambition. My late wife was the brilliant architect of our future, and I was the relentless physical force that made those blueprints real. When Camille passed away unexpectedly, the vibrant color drained from my entire world. I realized very quickly that the highly visible wealth we had accumulated over 40 years only attracted vicious parasites, men exactly like Bradley. Therefore, I quietly transferred my vast liquid assets and commercial properties into anonymous blind trusts. I consciously chose the life of a quiet pensioner. I needed to see exactly who would love and respect me when the money was entirely invisible. The devastating answer sitting at the table tonight was painfully clear. Bradley sharply tapped his heavy silver fork against the side of his crystal glass. The high ringing sound cut right through the loud dinner chatter. The entire table fell completely silent. He stood up slowly, adjusting his silk cuffs, projecting the posture of a self-made financial titan. He announced to the room that he had recently secured a phenomenal business deal and wanted to celebrate his success with family. He proudly declared that he was taking Jocelyn along with his own mother and father on a lavish 2-week vacation to a private rental villa in Paris. His parents gasped in performative delight, clapping their hands together. Jocelyn beamed brightly, throwing her arms around his neck, loudly praising his incredible generosity and business acumen. The air in the dining room grew thick with self-congratulatory celebration. I chewed a small piece of chicken, swallowing quietly, betraying no emotion. I waited for the inevitable pivot. Bradley slowly turned his gaze down the long expanse of polished oak until his eyes locked firmly onto mine. His arrogant smile shifted from triumphant to deeply patronizing. He spoke slowly, using the exact condescending tone one might use to explain a difficult concept to an ignorant child. He told me that the European travel budget was incredibly tight. He explained that flying 5 adults first class across the Atlantic and booking extra suites was simply a logistical impossibility at this stage in his career. He then added with a heavy theatrical sigh of feigned regret that they desperately needed someone highly responsible to stay behind and watch the sprawling property. He told me I was absolutely essential to the security of the house while they were abroad. He actively framed my deliberate exclusion from the family trip as a crucial honorable duty. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not drop my fork in shock. I absorbed the blatant insult with the absolute stillness I had practiced for the last 5 years. The true devastating strike did not come from Bradley. It came directly from the woman sitting beside him. Jocelyn leaned forward, swirling the deep red wine in her expensive glass. She looked at me, not with a shred of apology, but with a cold, irritated exhaustion. She told me that my constant looming presence in the annex was becoming highly suffocating. She said that walking past my closed door every single day felt incredibly heavy and draining. She stated loudly and clearly in front of her wealthy white in-laws that my depressing demeanor was actively draining the vital energy from her marriage. She boldly claimed they needed a severe break from my unending silence. She needed a break from the constant reminder of my grief over her mother. The cruel words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Camille would have wept uncontrollably to hear our beautiful daughter speak with such profound malice. We had given her absolutely everything, and she had allowed a man cloaked in false prestige to turn her heart into solid ice. The entire room waited anxiously for my reaction. Bradley's parents watched me with undisguised pity, sipping their vintage wine, clearly enjoying the pathetic spectacle of the destitute African-American father-in-law being put firmly in his proper place. I looked directly into Jocelyn's eyes. I saw the rigid defensive posture she immediately assumed, ready for a loud argument she could legally use to justify her cruelty. I outright refused to give her the satisfaction of my anger. Instead, I offered a smile. It was a calm, deeply serene smile that clearly unsettled the energy in the room. I told her I understood the situation completely. I wished them a remarkably safe and spectacular flight across the ocean. I told them Paris was a beautiful city this time of year, and they deserved exactly the vacation they had orchestrated for themselves. I stood up tall, picked up my modest porcelain plate, and pushed my heavy wooden chair in quietly. I turned my back on their luxurious dinner celebration and walked straight toward the kitchen doors. The heavy swing door closed shut behind me, completely cutting off the renewed sounds of their arrogant laughter. I placed my plate gently in the stainless steel sink and turned on the cold water. The kitchen was immaculate, smelling faintly of the expensive catered food they had ordered exclusively for themselves. I moved to the central island to throw away a used paper napkin. As I opened the lid of the large trash can, a bright flash of stark white caught my eye. It was a thick piece of heavy, high-quality cardstock, crumpled aggressively and buried hastily beneath wet coffee grounds. I reached down and pulled it out. I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against the cold granite counter. The harsh overhead kitchen light illuminated the bold black text printed across the page. It was a formal bank notice. More specifically, it was a harsh denial letter for a massive commercial line of credit. The letter was addressed directly to me. It bore my full legal name and my private social security number. The embossed seal at the top belonged to a highly exclusive, ruthless lending institution based in New York. The envelope had been violently torn open by someone else. Bradley had brazenly attempted to use my stolen identity to secure a massive financial loan, assuming my lack of visible wealth made me an easy, untraceable target. I flattened the heavy cardstock against the cold granite of the kitchen island. The harsh fluorescent light above cast sharp shadows over the deeply creased paper. The official seal of Sterling Continental Bank glared back at me in bold black ink. It was a formal notice of denial for a massive commercial line of credit. The requested amount was an astonishing $500,000. I ran my calloused index finger down the page, stopping dead at the section labeled Primary Guarantor. There, printed in undeniable black and white, was my full legal name and my private social security number. Bradley had brazenly stolen my identity. He had sifted through my personal belongings, extracted my most sensitive information, and attempted to leverage the very existence of a 70-year-old man to secure a fraudulent business loan. He assumed I was an incredibly easy mark. Every single month, Bradley watched me walk to the end of the driveway to collect a modest government pension check from the mailbox. He saw the faded flannel shirts I wore to tend the garden and the scuffed leather boots I left by the back door. He genuinely believed that meager monthly deposit was my sole financial lifeline. He had absolutely no idea about the international corporate entity I had formed decades ago. When my wife Camille and I first started acquiring commercial real estate in the late 80s, we faced a ruthless market. Navigating the corporate banking world as a young African-American couple meant constantly dealing with men who looked and sounded exactly like Bradley. Men who assumed we lacked the capital, the intelligence, or the sheer willpower to sit at their tables. Camille was a brilliant strategist. She taught me that visible wealth only acts as a beacon for parasites and predators. We bought distressed properties in red-line districts, renovated them with our own hands, and quietly built an empire while driving a 10-year-old sedan. We learned that true power operates entirely in the shadows. When Camille passed away 5 years ago, the grief nearly broke my spirit. I realized I no longer had any desire to play the exhausting game of societal prestige. I contacted my legal team and transferred my immense liquid wealth and vast property portfolio into a complex series of anonymous blind trusts. I chose the life of a quiet pensioner with absolute intentionality. I wanted to observe the true nature of the people around me when they thought I had absolutely nothing to offer them but my company and my quiet wisdom. Bradley had just shown me exactly who he was behind his charming corporate facade. He was a common thief dressed in custom Italian wool. I left the denial letter resting on the counter. The quiet hum of the stainless steel refrigerator was the only sound in the massive empty house. My daughter and her husband were asleep upstairs, resting peacefully in their Egyptian cotton sheets, while actively orchestrating my absolute financial ruin. I needed to know the full extent of the rot infecting my family. I walked out of the kitchen and quietly climbed the curved oak staircase. The thick designer carpet absorbed the heavy sound of my footsteps. I bypassed my daughter's bedroom, listening briefly to the rhythmic sound of their breathing, and walked straight to the end of the hallway toward Bradley's home office. I reached for the polished brass doorknob. It was locked tight. Bradley always kept his personal sanctuary secured loudly, claiming to anyone who would listen that he handled highly sensitive corporate documents that required absolute privacy. I reached deep into the front pocket of my denim trousers. My fingers closed around a heavy brass master key. I slid it into the lock and turned the mechanism with a sharp metallic click. Bradley operated under the arrogant delusion that he was the undisputed master of this sprawling suburban estate. He treated me like an unwanted squatter living purely on his benevolent charity. He did not know that the anonymous real estate conglomerate he leased this luxury property from was entirely owned and controlled by me. I was not his helpless guest. I was his landlord. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the room. The space reeked of expensive bourbon, imported leather, and desperate ambition. Framed photographs of Bradley shaking hands with minor local politicians lined the walls, positioned specifically to project an aura of unwavering influence. I ignored the cheap display of vanity and moved directly to his massive mahogany desk. A thick, leather-bound ledger sat wide open under the harsh glow of a green glass banker's lamp. Bradley had clearly been reviewing his accounts right before making his lavish dinner announcement. I leaned over the desk and studied the chaotic columns of red ink. The numbers told a story of catastrophic financial incompetence. Bradley's supposedly booming logistics consulting firm was an absolute mirage. He was hemorrhaging money at an unbelievable rate. He had taken out massive high-interest loans to maintain the hollow appearance of immense wealth. He leased the luxury cars sitting in the driveway. He financed the designer suits hanging in his closet. He was drowning in his own manufactured prestige. I traced my finger down the most recent entries and felt a sudden sharp coldness expand in my chest. Bradley owed $200,000 to a private equity group known in the city for employing highly dangerous extra-legal collection methods. The payment was severely past due. The grand family vacation to Paris was not a joyous celebration of his corporate success. It was a desperate, panicked flight from his ruthless creditors. I picked up the heavy leather ledger to examine the previous month's detailed entries. As I lifted the book, a single sheet of heavy paper fluttered out from underneath and landed face up on the polished mahogany surface. I picked it up and read the header. It was a formal real estate appraisal agreement from Century Estate Group, a firm known for swift, aggressive property liquidations. The document explicitly authorized an expedited all-cash sale of the very house we were currently standing in. Bradley had forged Jocelyn's signature perfectly as the required co-signer. I looked at the date scheduled for the physical inspection. It was set for tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The sheer mechanical cruelty of the timing hit me like a physical blow. Bradley had timed his operation perfectly. The precise moment they boarded their first-class flight to France, a covert agent would arrive to evaluate the property, change the locks, and list it for immediate liquidation. Bradley intended to sell the house right out from under me while he sipped expensive champagne over the Atlantic Ocean. He planned to leave me entirely homeless and destitute, completely unaware of the transaction until the new owners arrived with a formal eviction notice. He assumed I would be forced onto the streets too poor and too ignorant to mount a legal defense. I folded the appraisal form tightly and slid it deep into my pocket. I turned off the green banker's lamp, plunging the room back into darkness, and locked the office door securely behind me. The dynamic of this relationship had fundamentally changed in the span of 30 minutes. Bradley thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a vulnerable, uneducated old man. He was about to find out he had just declared an unwinnable war on a ghost with absolutely unlimited resources. I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against the cold granite counter. The harsh overhead kitchen light illuminated the bold black text printed across the page. It was a formal bank notice. More specifically, it was a harsh denial letter for a massive commercial line of credit. The letter was addressed directly to me. It bore my full legal name and my private social security number. The embossed seal at the top belonged to a highly exclusive, ruthless lending institution based in New York. The envelope had been violently torn open by someone else. Bradley had brazenly attempted to use my stolen identity to secure a massive financial loan, assuming my lack of visible wealth made me an easy, untraceable target. I left the suffocating air of the main house and quietly made my way down the back staircase. I slipped out the side door, stepping into the cool night air. The walk to my annex took only a few seconds, but the contrast between the main property and my living quarters was vast. Bradley lived in a world of manufactured opulence surrounded by imported rugs, velvet drapes, and expensive art he did not understand. My space was strictly utilitarian. A single bed, a small kitchenette, a plain wooden desk. It was exactly what I wanted. It was exactly what Camille and I had always valued before our bank accounts swelled beyond comprehension. I closed the thin door of the annex and locked the deadbolt securely. I knelt on the worn linoleum floor near the corner of the small room. With a firm push, I dislodged a loose wooden baseboard. Behind it lay a small fireproof lockbox. I input the code, flipped the heavy latch, and pulled out a secure satellite mobile phone. I had not turned this device on in over 3 years. I pressed the power button, watching the small screen illuminate the dark room. I dialed a private encrypted number that bypassed every standard receptionist and went straight to the personal desk of Mr. Gallagher. Gallagher was a ruthless, brilliant wealth manager who had navigated the treacherous waters of international finance for Camille and me since the late 80s. He was fiercely loyal, operating with a level of discretion that bordered on the obsessive. The line clicked open immediately. Gallagher did not offer a polite greeting. He knew that if this specific phone was ringing, a critical threshold had been crossed. I told him we had a severe security breach. I explained that Bradley had actively stolen my social security number and attempted to secure a massive commercial line of credit to cover his disastrous private debts. Furthermore, Bradley had scheduled a covert real estate appraisal for tomorrow morning to liquidate the property while he was in Paris. Gallagher let out a sharp, ragged breath. He asked me for my immediate directives. I did not hesitate. I ordered him to execute a total and permanent freeze on the Shadow Trust. For the past 3 years, that specific blind trust had been silently subsidizing Bradley and Jocelyn's lavish lifestyle. Every time Bradley assumed his business was turning a miraculous profit, it was actually my trust quietly paying their mortgage, covering their luxury car leases, and erasing their high-interest credit card debt. I had subsidized their vanity, foolishly hoping that the financial safety net would allow Bradley to mature into a responsible provider for my daughter. I had been completely wrong. The safety net had merely enabled his profound arrogance and blinded my daughter to reality. Gallagher typed furiously on his end of the line. He warned me that initiating the freeze would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. He reminded me of the promise I made when Camille passed away. I had sworn to maintain the illusion of being a destitute pensioner, a quiet, old African-American man living on government checks. Camille had always warned me that if Jocelyn ever knew the true astronomical extent of our liquid wealth, she would become entirely dependent on it. Camille wanted our daughter to build her own character, her own resilience far away from the toxic, corrupting influence of unearned millions. Exposing my power now would permanently shatter that carefully constructed reality. I told Gallagher that the illusion had completely outlived its usefulness. The protective shield we placed around Jocelyn had inadvertently turned her into an entitled stranger, completely manipulated by a man who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset. The parasite was no longer just feeding on the host. The parasite was actively trying to consume and destroy the host. Bradley had crossed the line from quiet exploitation into aggressive criminal fraud. I told Gallagher to sever every single financial lifeline Bradley unknowingly relied upon. By tomorrow morning, Bradley's primary checking accounts would hit zero. His credit cards would decline. The hollow empire he built on my silent charity would collapse into dust. Gallagher confirmed the freeze was in motion. He then stated he needed to secure the perimeter around my stolen identity. He ran a deep trace on the credit inquiry Bradley had initiated. The sound of his rapid typing filled the silence of my annex. Within seconds, Gallagher bypassed the standard firewalls of Bradley's personal accounts. He accessed the digital footprint of Bradley's upcoming trip to France. Gallagher's voice dropped an octave. He informed me that the situation was far more complicated than a simple family vacation. Bradley had not booked a standard luxury hotel in Paris. He had engaged an international luxury property broker. He was spending a staggering amount of borrowed money to rent an ultra-exclusive private estate in the French countryside. I asked Gallagher why a man drowning in $200,000 of dangerous debt would throw away massive capital on a vacation rental. Gallagher pulled up Bradley's email correspondence. Bradley was orchestrating a high-stakes dinner. He had invited a remarkably wealthy, highly influential French investor named Monsieur Dupont to the estate. Bradley intended to use the lavish surroundings to project an image of immense personal wealth, hoping to trick Dupont into signing a lucrative partnership deal that would save Bradley from total bankruptcy. Bradley was risking federal fraud charges to stage a theatrical performance for a European billionaire. I gripped the phone tightly. I told Gallagher that Bradley was clearly attempting to leverage my stolen credit line to fund this desperate charade. I needed to know exactly where he was going. I asked for the exact name of the property Bradley had rented to host this fraudulent dinner. Gallagher read the rental agreement aloud from his secure monitor. The property was a historic, sprawling villa located just outside of Paris. The international broker listed it under the name Le Château des Ombres. My breath caught in my throat. I stood absolutely frozen in the center of the small, dimly lit annex. A profound, icy clarity washed over my entire body. I knew every marble pillar, every wrought iron gate, and every manicured hedge of that specific estate. 10 years ago, Camille had fallen in love with the architecture of that magnificent French property. I had purchased the entire estate in cash as a surprise anniversary gift for her. We had spent our happiest summers walking through those exact gardens. Bradley was not just using my stolen identity to fund his arrogant European vacation. He was using my stolen credit to rent my own private villa. The dawn light barely breached the heavy velvet curtains of the main house, when the frantic, arrogant sounds of departure shattered the quiet morning. I stood silently in the massive, pristine kitchen, holding a simple ceramic mug of black coffee. I listened to the heavy thud of designer luggage being dragged down the grand oak staircase. For a man drowning in $200,000 of dangerous high-interest debt, Bradley certainly knew how to pack like a billionaire. I remained entirely still, leaning against the cold granite island, watching the final act of their pathetic domestic theater unfold. I needed them to feel absolutely secure in their false dominance. I needed them to board that transatlantic flight believing they had successfully conquered a helpless, ignorant old man. Bradley strode into the kitchen with the exaggerated posture of a conquering king. He wore a sharply tailored slate-gray suit that cost more than most working families earned in a month. He checked his reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator, adjusting a silk tie that felt like a loud proclamation of his manufactured success. He did not offer a polite morning greeting. He did not acknowledge me as a father or a house guest. He simply reached into his slim leather wallet, extracted a single crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it carelessly onto the polished counter. The green paper landed mere inches from my coffee mug. I looked at the bill, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. Bradley buttoned his suit jacket and delivered his final set of degrading instructions. He told me to use the cash to buy generic brand groceries from the discount market down the street. He explicitly forbade me from ordering food or utilizing any of the expensive ingredients stocked in the pantry. He then pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. He strictly ordered me not to touch the central climate control while they were enjoying their lavish vacation in Paris. He stated that the house was to remain exactly at 60 degrees to conserve energy, loudly complaining that heating a house for a single inactive pensioner was a massive waste of his hard-earned capital. He commanded me to wear a sweater if I felt a draft, framing his profound stinginess as a lesson in fiscal responsibility. I did not point out the absurd hypocrisy of a man lecturing me on fiscal responsibility while secretly defaulting on massive loans. I did not mention that the very roof over his head belonged entirely to the anonymous corporate trust I controlled. I simply offered a slow, compliant nod. Jocelyn walked into the kitchen moments later. She was draped in a lightweight European trench coat, holding a leather handbag that Bradley had purchased using the fraudulent credit line he secured under her name. She looked exhausted, irritable, and entirely inconvenienced by my physical presence. She approached me to offer a performative farewell. It was not a genuine embrace. She leaned in awkwardly, ensuring her expensive coat did not fully press against my body. She gave me a stiff, half-hearted pat on the shoulder, as she pulled back her nose wrinkled in undisguised disgust. She told me that my faded flannel shirt smelled like dust and old wood. She complained that my entire wardrobe was an act of embarrassment, suggesting I use the $50 Bradley left to buy something presentable so the neighbors would not mistake me for a vagrant. She sighed heavily, claiming she desperately needed the crisp air of the French countryside to cleanse her palate from the depressing atmosphere of my suburban annex. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the foyer, eagerly anticipating a luxury vacation that was officially built on a foundation of severe federal crimes. I remained standing at the kitchen island, staring down at the crumpled $50 bill. My calloused fingers traced the worn edges of the paper. A flood of vivid, heavy memories washed over my mind. 30 years ago, I did not have the luxury of a warm kitchen or a quiet morning. I remembered waking up at 4 in the morning to work the heavy shipping docks in the freezing rain. I remembered finishing that grueling shift and driving directly to a dusty, unventilated warehouse to manage inventory until midnight. I worked 3 brutal, bone-breaking manual labor jobs just to cover the exorbitant tuition fees for Jocelyn's elite private academy. Camille and I had sacrificed every ounce of our personal comfort to ensure our daughter never had to understand the crushing weight of poverty. I paid her tuition in full every single semester with hands covered in blisters and engine grease. I never asked my daughter for a single word of gratitude. I only asked that she utilize the education to build a life of genuine substance. Now she looked at the hands that had built her entire foundation and saw only a dusty, useless old man. She saw a burden to be managed, completely blind to the fact that her husband was leading her directly into a catastrophic legal nightmare. The sharp honk of an aggressive car horn interrupted my thoughts. A sleek black town car pulled into the wide driveway, crushing the gravel under its heavy tires. Bradley's parents had arrived for the airport transfer. I walked slowly to the front door and stepped out onto the porch to observe the departure. Bradley's father stepped out of the vehicle wearing a pretentious tweed coat, projecting the loud arrogance of a man who had inherited a modest sum and promptly lost most of it to bad investments. His wife followed closely behind, adjusting a pair of oversized designer sunglasses. They did not offer a handshake. They looked at me standing on the porch in my faded flannel and sneered openly. Bradley's mother gestured vaguely toward the front yard. She mocked the modest, carefully maintained flower beds I tended to every week. She loudly declared that the landscaping was incredibly pedestrian, stating it was a profound pity Bradley could not afford a professional crew to fix the tragic state of the soil. Bradley chuckled in agreement, telling his mother that finding decent help was impossible, especially when relying on free labor from relatives. They loaded their pristine designer luggage into the spacious trunk of the town car. They climbed into the plush leather seats, eagerly discussing the vintage wines they planned to consume the moment they landed in Paris. Jocelyn did not look back at the house. Bradley offered me a final mocking salute from the passenger window. I stood on the porch, my hands resting in my pockets, and waved them off with a perfect, serene smile. I watched the town car reverse out of the driveway, turn the corner, and disappear completely down the quiet suburban street. The moment the vehicle vanished from sight, the tired, hunched posture I had maintained for 5 years vanished completely. I stood up straight. I walked back inside the house and locked the heavy oak door with a sharp, decisive click. I returned to the kitchen and picked up the crumpled $50 bill Bradley had tossed on the counter. I held it over the stainless steel sink. I dropped the bill directly into the dark drain. I reached forward and flipped the heavy switch on the wall. The garbage disposal roared to life, grinding the paper currency into absolutely nothing. The loud mechanical destruction was the exact sound of their old reality dying forever. I turned off the disposal and wiped my hands on a clean towel. I walked to the front window and looked out at the empty driveway. A sudden flash of chrome caught the morning sun. A spotless, pitch-black Mercedes sedan turned onto the property and glided silently up the driveway. The heavy vehicle came to a smooth halt directly in front of the porch. The driver's side door swung open. Mr. Gallagher stepped out onto the pavement. He wore a severe, immaculate black suit and carried a thick, reinforced leather briefcase in his right hand. He looked up at the house, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. The trap was officially set, and it was time to deploy the first countermeasure against the appraiser Bradley had foolishly sent to claim my territory. Mr. Gallagher did not even knock. He stepped onto the porch and crossed the threshold with the absolute authority of a man who held the financial fate of entire corporations in his reinforced leather briefcase. I closed the heavy oak door behind him, sealing us inside the quiet house. We did not exchange pleasantries. Gallagher possessed a mind entirely devoted to strategic execution, and the grim line of his mouth indicated that the counteroffensive was already fully operational. He placed his briefcase on the foyer table, the polished brass lock snapping open with a sharp sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Before he could extract the first document, a harsh, aggressive pounding rattled the front door. Exactly 30 minutes had passed since Bradley's town car had vanished down the street. Bradley's timing was ruthlessly precise. I opened the door to find a man standing on my welcome mat who completely embodied the predatory nature of cheap real estate liquidation. He wore a loud, poorly fitted plaid suit that smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He clutched a thick plastic clipboard against his chest like a shield. His eyes darted nervously around the property, assessing the valuable fixtures and the square footage with the hungry, desperate look of a scavenger. He did not introduce himself politely. He immediately wedged the toe of his scuffed leather shoe directly into the doorframe to prevent me from closing it. He demanded immediate entry to the premises. He spoke in a rapid, highly aggressive cadence, attempting to bulldoze his way past my physical presence. He loudly announced that he was officially contracted by the primary homeowner to conduct an expedited, comprehensive interior appraisal for an immediate cash sale. I stood my ground, blocking the entryway with my body. I asked him calmly who exactly he believed the primary homeowner to be. The agent let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He flipped a page on his clipboard and shoved a legally dubious document directly into my face. The agent proudly declared that Bradley held a comprehensive legal power of attorney. He looked at my faded flannel shirt and worn boots with absolute disdain. He told me that Bradley had explicitly warned him about my presence. The agent practically spat the words out, stating that he was fully authorized to bypass the senile, destitute father-in-law who squatted in the annex. He ordered me to step aside immediately, threatening to call local law enforcement to have me forcibly removed for obstructing a lawful real estate transaction. I did not move a single inch. I looked at the forged signature on the fraudulent power of attorney. The sheer depth of Bradley's betrayal crystallized in my mind. Bradley had not simply forged a document to secure a quick loan, he had systematically built a false legal narrative portraying me as mentally incompetent and financially ruined. He had laid the meticulous groundwork to legally strip me of my autonomy, intending to throw me onto the street while shielding himself behind the devastating lie of my supposed senility. He wanted to erase me completely. I did not argue with the aggressive man standing on my porch. I simply took a half step backward and allowed Mr. Gallagher to step smoothly out of the shadows of the foyer. The atmospheric shift in the entryway was instantaneous and brutal. Gallagher possessed a predatory stillness that immediately paralyzed the sleazy real estate agent. The agent took one look at Gallagher's immaculate black suit, his cold, unblinking eyes, and the aura of untouchable corporate power he radiated. The cheap confidence completely drained from the appraiser's face. He instinctively pulled his scuffed shoe out of the doorframe. Gallagher did not raise his voice. He spoke with the chilling, measured precision of a legal executioner. He informed the agent that the document he currently held was a catastrophic forgery. Gallagher reached into his open briefcase and extracted a pristine, heavy parchment document embossed with a glowing golden seal. He held it up so the agent could clearly read the bold, unmistakable text. Gallagher explained that the property did not belong to Bradley. It never had. The entire estate was legally owned by a highly secure international holding company. Gallagher then delivered the fatal blow. He pointed a steady, manicured finger directly at me. He informed the trembling agent that the quiet man standing in the faded flannel shirt was the sole majority shareholder of that exact holding company. I was the absolute owner of the estate, the land, and every single brick on the property. The agent's face turned the color of wet ash. He looked frantically between the official deed of trust and my perfectly calm expression. Gallagher did not give the man a single second to recover his breath. He systematically dismantled the agent's entire life. Gallagher stated that attempting to appraise and liquidate a property using forged documents constituted severe criminal trespassing and a highly coordinated conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. He promised the agent that if he did not vacate the premises within 5 seconds, the full unlimited financial weight of my legal team would be unleashed to destroy his career, revoke his professional licenses, and ensure he spent the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The agent dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden porch. He did not attempt to apologize. He did not try to explain himself. He spun around, practically tripping over his own feet in his absolute terror, and sprinted down the driveway toward his rusted sedan. He threw his clipboard into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and reversed out of the property so recklessly that his tires tore deep, ugly gouges into the manicured grass. We watched in total silence until his car disappeared from view. Gallagher turned to me and snapped his leather briefcase shut. The local perimeter was now entirely secure. Bradley's pathetic attempt to liquidate my home had been neutralized in less than 5 minutes. But the true battlefield was no longer in this quiet suburban neighborhood. The war had officially moved across the Atlantic Ocean. Gallagher reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew a sleek, heavy envelope and extended his hand. I took the envelope and slid my thumb under the heavy wax seal. Inside rested a pristine first-class boarding pass for a direct non-stop flight to Paris, departing in exactly 3 hours. Beneath the boarding pass was a secure digital keycard and a detailed logistical itinerary. Gallagher briefed me on the precise timeline. Bradley Jocelyn and his arrogant parents were currently halfway across the ocean. Upon landing at Charles de Gaulle Airport, they were scheduled to take a scenic, leisurely luxury train ride deep into the French countryside toward the villa. Bradley had orchestrated the slow transport to ensure they arrived at the estate just as the sun began to set, hoping to maximize the dramatic impact of the architecture for his parents. Their vanity was their ultimate critical weakness. Gallagher looked at his platinum wristwatch. He calculated the exact trajectory of both travel plans. If I took the waiting private transport to the airport right now and utilized the expedited first-class routing, Gallagher had arranged my flight would touch down in Paris hours ahead of their train schedule. A private helicopter was already fully fueled and waiting at a secure Parisian airstrip to bypass all local traffic. I would completely beat them to the countryside. I looked down at the boarding pass. The name printed on the ticket was my own, but the man preparing to board that plane was not the quiet, dusty pensioner Jocelyn had sneered at this morning. That man was dead. I looked at Gallagher and nodded once. I turned away from the front door and walked toward the master bedroom to change my clothes. I had to arrive at Le Château des Ombres before the parasites reached the grand iron gates. The host needed to be properly dressed to welcome his ungrateful guests. The transition from the cold suburban pavement to the pressurized silence of the transatlantic flight felt instantaneous. The private first-class cabin wrapped around me in a cocoon of muted leather and polished wood, a stark departure from the cramped, dusty annex I had occupied for the past 5 years. The heavy roar of the jet engines faded into a dull, continuous hum as the aircraft pierced the thick cloud cover over the eastern seaboard. I stood up in the spacious private lavatory and unbuttoned the faded, threadbare flannel shirt I had worn that morning. I let the cheap fabric drop to the floor. It was the uniform of a discarded man, a disguise that had served its purpose and was no longer required. In its place, I pulled on the garments Mr. Gallagher had meticulously arranged in a dark garment bag. The crisp, white cotton of the dress shirt felt sharp and rigid against my skin. I slid my arms into a meticulously tailored charcoal suit woven from heavy, immaculate wool. The fabric draped over my shoulders with the precision of custom armor. I adjusted the silk tie, feeling the familiar, dormant weight of corporate authority settle back into my posture. I looked at my reflection in the polished mirror. The destitute, invisible pensioner was entirely gone. The man staring back was the ruthless architect of an international empire fully awakened and preparing for war. I returned to my wide leather seat and lowered the heavy window shade, plunging my section of the cabin into a cool, focused darkness. I engaged the small overhead reading lamp. Its sharp beam illuminated the thick leather briefcase Gallagher had handed me on the driveway. I snapped the brass locks open. The briefcase contained a single massive dossier bound in heavy black cardstock. It was the complete, unfiltered financial footprint of my son-in-law. I opened the cover and began to read. Gallagher's investigative team had performed a total forensic dissection of Bradley's life. The first 20 pages detailed the complete collapse of his logistics consulting firm. Bradley had never generated a single dollar of actual sustainable profit. His entire business model consisted of securing high-interest loans to pay off older, aggressively compounding debts. He had created a chaotic web of shell companies moving borrowed capital from one phantom account to another, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of overwhelming corporate success. The red ink bled across the pages in staggering, catastrophic numbers. The lavish dinners, the designer suits, the leased luxury vehicles, and the arrogant displays of wealth were all funded by money he simply did not possess. Bradley was completely hollow. He was a spectacular empty facade teetering on the absolute edge of total bankruptcy. I turned the page and delved deeper into the toxic architecture of his private loans. The numbers shifted from traditional corporate debt to something far more dangerous. Bradley had exhausted every legitimate banking institution in the city. He had turned to private, unregulated equity firms known for utilizing vicious extra-legal methods to secure their returns. These were not men who sent polite collection notices in the mail. These were men who seized assets by force and ruined lives without a second thought. Bradley owed them $200,000, a massive balloon payment that had already defaulted. The supposed celebratory vacation to Paris was a frantic, terrified escape from the physical consequences of his own financial incompetence. The sheer scale of his reckless desperation was infuriating, but the true horror of the dossier lay buried in the final section. I turned to a thick stack of commercial loan guarantees. The overhead light caught the blue ink of the signatures at the bottom of the pages. I leaned forward, my heart turning to solid ice. Bradley had not just forged my signature to secure a fraudulent credit line. That was merely a desperate act of trespassing. The documents in front of me revealed a betrayal far more profound and devastating. Bradley had heavily leveraged Jocelyn's identity. He had tied her name legally and irrevocably to his massive toxic commercial debts. There were dozens of pages bearing her forged signature authorizing aggressive loans and binding her as the primary financial guarantor for his failing companies. Jocelyn had absolutely no knowledge of these transactions. She believed she was married to a self-made titan of industry. She believed her luxurious lifestyle was the natural reward for her husband's brilliant business acumen. She had walked through my kitchen that morning wrapped in an expensive European trench coat, complaining about the smell of my clothes, completely blind to the fact that she was standing on a trap door. I stared at the forged signatures until the blue ink blurred. The arrogant, dismissive daughter who had sat at the dining table and demanded a break from my depressing presence was a phantom. The reality was that Jocelyn was in imminent, unavoidable danger of federal prosecution. When Bradley's house of cards finally collapsed, the banking authorities and the private creditors would not just target him. They would execute a ruthless legal assault on Jocelyn. They would seize her assets, destroy her credit, and hold her criminally liable for the massive scale of her husband's deceit. She was legally tethered to a sinking ship, and the heavy iron chains were wrapped directly around her neck. The realization hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow. Jocelyn was not merely arrogant. She was a victim marching blindly toward total destruction. The intense anger I had felt toward her evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. If I simply handed her a check to clear the debt, Bradley would immediately recognize his invincibility. He would continue to manipulate her, leveraging my hidden wealth to fund his dangerous ambitions until he eventually destroyed us all. A soft intervention would only feed the parasite. The lesson had to be absolute. It had to be brutal, comprehensive, and totally unforgiving. I had to let the entire false reality shatter around her. I had to orchestrate a collision with reality so violent that it would permanently sever her psychological and financial dependence on the man who had secretly ruined her. She needed to understand the true weight of the world, and I was going to drop it directly onto her shoulders. The steady hum of the jet engines shifted in pitch as the aircraft began its long descent through the dense cloud cover. The sprawling gray geometry of the Parisian suburbs materialized through the window. The plane banked sharply, aligning with the long runway at Charles de Gaulle Airport. The wheels touched down on French soil with a heavy, definitive impact. The transatlantic journey was over. The execution phase of the operation had officially begun. I waited for the aircraft to come to a complete halt on the private tarmac. I reached into the interior pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and withdrew my secure mobile phone. I held the power button down. The dark screen flashed to life, immediately connecting to the local European cellular towers. A digital notification chimed instantly in the quiet cabin. A small voicemail icon appeared on the screen, pulsing with a bright, urgent red light. I tapped the icon and raised the phone to my ear. The frantic, highly agitated voice of Laurent echoed through the small speaker. Laurent was my trusted, meticulous Parisian property manager. He was the man tasked with overseeing the immaculate preservation of Le Château des Ombres. His usually composed French accent was entirely stripped away by raw panic. He spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in sheer disbelief. Laurent informed me that the arrogant American businessman who had rented the estate for the week had just triggered a catastrophic financial alert. Bradley had attempted to wire the massive mandatory security deposit required to unlock the front gates of the villa. Laurent's voice dropped into a tone of absolute disgust. He reported that the international wire transfer had bounced violently. Bradley's primary banking institution had completely rejected the transaction. The secondary credit cards Bradley had placed on file had all returned severe immediate fraud alerts. The financial freeze Gallagher and I had initiated from my suburban annex had successfully crossed the ocean. The trap had snapped shut with bone-breaking force. Bradley was currently speeding toward a fortress he could no longer afford to enter, utterly stripped of the false armor he used to conquer the world. The black Mercedes glided over the smooth French asphalt with predatory grace. Malcolm sat in the spacious rear cabin watching the dense gray geometry of the Parisian suburbs dissolve into the vibrant rolling green of the sprawling countryside. The transition from the sterile environment of the private aircraft to the historic landscape of France perfectly mirrored the profound shift in his own internal state. He was no longer the passive observer hiding in a dusty suburban annex tolerating the daily humiliations inflicted by a parasitic son-in-law. He was the active architect of Bradley's imminent destruction. Malcolm adjusted the cuffs of his meticulously tailored charcoal suit, the heavy, immaculate wool draped over his shoulders with the precision of custom armor. The faded flannel shirt and the scuffed boots were gone. The destitute pensioner had been completely erased. The man now approaching the estate was the ruthless controller of a vast international empire, fully awakened and prepared for an absolute war. The journey from the private airstrip took precisely 45 minutes. The vehicle turned onto a highly secluded, tree-lined avenue that stretched far away from the main public roads. At the very end of the long avenue, the imposing wrought-iron gates of Le Château des Ombres rose into view. The intricate metalwork forged over a century ago stood as a formidable, unyielding barrier between the outside world and the immense wealth hidden within. The driver flashed a highly secure credential to the armed perimeter guard stationed inside the stone gatehouse. The heavy iron gates swung open smoothly and silently, allowing the master of the house to finally return. The tires crunched rhythmically against the crushed white stone of the massive circular driveway. The estate itself was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of classic French chateau architecture built from pale historic stone that seemed to glow radiantly in the late afternoon sun. Malcolm stepped out of the vehicle before his driver even had the opportunity to open the heavy door. Standing on the pristine gravel, waiting with rigid, impeccable posture, was Laurent. The Parisian property manager wore a perfectly tailored suit, representing the highest standard of European estate management. When Laurent recognized the man stepping out of the car, his deeply ingrained professional composure briefly shattered. It was replaced by an expression of profound, genuine shock. Laurent rushed forward and bowed his head in a deep traditional show of absolute respect. He expressed his overwhelming astonishment, stating clearly that the entire staff had never expected to see Monsieur Malcolm return to the property. Laurent spoke softly, his voice thick with the heavy emotional significance of the moment. He gently reminded Malcolm that this was his first physical visit to the grand estate in 5 long years. Malcolm looked up at the towering stone facade and felt a sharp, fiercely familiar ache expand in his chest. He remembered exactly why he had abandoned this beautiful fortress. Camille had spent 2 entire summers working directly with elite historic preservationists to completely redesign the interior architectural details. She had personally chosen the exact molding in the grand ballroom, the specific placement of the massive crystal chandeliers, and the intricate hand-painted tile patterns in the conservatory. When she passed away unexpectedly, the sheer magnificent beauty of the chateau became a massive, suffocating monument to her agonizing absence. The memories woven into the very walls were simply too heavy for Malcolm to endure entirely alone. He had locked the estate away in a blind trust, trusting Laurent to maintain the immaculate preservation of his wife's final glorious masterpiece. Today, however, the overwhelming grief was entirely suppressed by the immediate burning necessity of the mission. The pain was weaponized into cold resolve. Malcolm instructed Laurent to lead the way inside. They walked together through the towering oak double doors and entered the grand foyer. The space was vast and echoing, featuring a sweeping double marble staircase that dominated the center of the room. Malcolm conducted a rapid, completely silent inspection of the premises. He moved gracefully through the grand ballroom, noting the flawless condition of the towering gilded mirrors and the highly polished hardwood floors. He walked into the pristine, formal dining area, where a massive mahogany table sat under a cascading, multi-tiered chandelier. Everything was exactly as Camille had left it. It was a space built exclusively for royalty. It was a space Bradley arrogantly believed he could temporarily conquer using stolen funds and forged documents. Malcolm turned to his property manager, his posture radiating unyielding authority. The time for quiet sentimentality had officially passed. He asked Laurent for a direct, unfiltered update on the financial status of the current American booking. Laurent immediately confirmed the catastrophic failure of the client's payment. He stated that the massive security deposit had been entirely rejected by the international banking authorities. The international wire transfer had bounced violently, and the secondary credit cards Bradley had placed on file had all returned severe immediate fraud alerts. Because of this total financial default, Laurent explained that the rental contract was now legally null and void. Laurent reached for the communication radio clipped to his lapel. He asked Malcolm for permission to deploy the security team intending to lock down the perimeter and turn the incoming American guests away at the main gate. Malcolm shook his head slowly. He issued a completely different, highly specific directive. He ordered Laurent to cancel the rental agreement immediately in the official corporate system, but he explicitly commanded the security guards to open the heavy iron gates the moment Bradley's party arrived. Malcolm insisted that the Americans must be allowed onto the private grounds. They must be permitted to exit their vehicle and walk proudly through the front doors. The illusion of their grand European triumph had to be allowed to reach its absolute zenith before it was violently and permanently shattered. Laurent nodded silently, instantly recognizing the icy, dangerous authority in Malcolm's voice. He relayed the specific orders to the perimeter security team via his earpiece. Malcolm then instructed the entire household staff to retreat immediately to the hidden service wings. He wanted the massive grand foyer to be completely empty when the guests entered. He walked over to a dark wood side table where a heavy crystal decanter and matching glasses rested on a polished silver tray. He poured himself a generous measure of vintage Bordeaux. The rich red liquid caught the fading golden sunlight streaming through the tall cathedral windows. The massive house fell into an absolute breathless silence. A distinct heavy sound suddenly broke the stillness of the estate. It was the loud, uneven crunch of thick tires grinding against the pristine white gravel of the long driveway. Bradley's rented commercial transport van was approaching the house. Malcolm picked up his crystal glass and walked slowly back into the center of the massive grand foyer. He approached the base of the sweeping marble staircase and began his ascent. He climbed the wide, curving steps with deliberate, highly measured pacing. He reached the wide landing at the very top, turning around smoothly to look down at the heavy oak double doors below. The deep rumble of the transport van echoed loudly outside. Car doors slammed with aggressive force. Loud, distinctly arrogant American voices began to carry through the thick stone walls. Bradley was loudly complaining about the bumpy rural roads, shouting orders at a driver he deemed incompetent. Jocelyn's voice followed immediately, expressing her absolute exhaustion and demanding to know why the staff was not waiting outside to carry their designer luggage. Malcolm stood perfectly still at the apex of the marble stairs, a dark silhouette against the glowing windows. He took a slow, appreciative sip of the vintage Bordeaux. He looked down at the entrance, waiting with endless patience for his arrogant son-in-law to push open the doors to a kingdom he did not own. The financial trap had completely closed, and the hour of absolute reckoning had finally arrived. The heavy iron-studded oak doors of Le Château des Ombres did not simply open. They were violently shoved apart. The sheer, unmannered force sent a deep shudder through the ancient, meticulously oiled hinges, a harsh violation of the absolute breathless stillness I had cultivated in the grand foyer. The chaotic, abrasive noise of my son-in-law arrived seconds before he actually crossed the threshold. Bradley stormed into the immaculate space, his voice echoing sharply off the soaring stone ceilings. He was dragging a massive scuffed leather suitcase behind him, his face flushed with a volatile mixture of travel exhaustion and entitled rage. He loudly cursed the uneven gravel of the long private driveway, the perceived incompetence of the rural French transport driver, and the utter lack of a subservient welcoming committee. He dropped the heavy luggage onto the pristine, hand-polished marble floor with a resounding, disrespectful thud that made the crystal drops on the chandeliers tremble. Bradley's parents followed immediately behind him, bringing their own distinct brand of toxic, suffocating energy into the serene environment. His mother clutched her designer handbag to her chest, as if she expected a common thief to emerge from the historic shadows. Her sharp, judgmental eyes scanned the priceless 16th-century tapestries with a look of hungry, calculating greed. She loudly complained that the countryside air was entirely too damp for her joints and demanded to know why a property of this supposed elite caliber did not have a full team of uniformed porters waiting at attention by the front gate. His father simply sneered at the vaulted ceilings, adjusting his thick tweed coat and muttering that massive European estates always felt incredibly drafty, poorly insulated, and desperately in need of American modernization. They stood right in the center of my magnificent foyer, projecting the undeniable, deeply offensive aura of conquering monarchs, surveying a newly acquired primitive territory. They were the very definition of the ugly American tourist, completely devoid of grace or basic human decency. Jocelyn was the last to enter the grand space. She stepped over the polished brass threshold and stopped completely dead in her tracks. She let her expensive, heavily branded travel bag slide slowly from her shoulder, her eyes wide with unadulterated awe. She turned in a slow, complete circle, entirely captivated by the sweeping double marble staircase, the towering gilded mirrors that stretched endlessly toward the vaulted ceiling, and the intricate hand-painted tile patterns that perfectly framed the arched entrance to the magnificent sunlit conservatory. I watched her intently from the dark shadows of the second-floor landing, my grip tightening slightly on the stem of my crystal wine glass. She marveled at the opulent perfection of the space, entirely oblivious to the profound, tragic irony of her intense admiration. She did not realize that the majestic arching lines of the conservatory and the precise repeating floral motifs on the porcelain tiles were not the work of some anonymous French architect. They were the exact meticulous sketches her mother Camille used to draw at our modest kitchen table when Jocelyn was just a little girl. Camille had spent countless quiet evenings drafting those precise architectural details with her fine-tipped blue pens, dreaming aloud of a sanctuary we would one day build together to celebrate our survival. Jocelyn had sat at that same table eating her cereal, watching her mother draw, yet she had never truly seen the vision. Now she was standing inside the physical, breathtaking manifestation of her mother's greatest dream, blindly attributing its glorious existence to the fraudulent criminal machinations of the parasite she had married. She believed Bradley's counterfeit corporate success had secured this paradise, utterly unaware that she was standing inside the very heart of the empire her parents had forged from pure grit. Bradley's patience, always incredibly thin and entirely dependent on the subservience of others, evaporated completely in the echoing silence of the chateau. His grand triumph was being ruined by the glaring lack of an audience. He clapped his hands together with a sharp, aggressive crack, demanding immediate attention from a staff that I had explicitly ordered to vanish into the service wings. He shouted the name of the elite international broker he had used to secure the booking, his voice cracking with a panicked, furious strain. He yelled out for the property manager, demanding that someone materialize instantly to carry their heavy bags, serve them chilled refreshments, and confirm the catering arrangements for the highly critical dinner with Monsieur Dupont. His face grew redder by the second as the profound, heavy silence of the estate actively mocked his desperate attempts at commanding authority. He turned to his parents, puffing out his chest, attempting to salvage his crumbling facade of infinite wealth and absolute control. He loudly promised his father that heads would absolutely roll for this unforgivable level of disrespect. He threatened to have the entire French household staff fired on the spot, legally blacklisted, and driven out of the luxury hospitality industry by morning. He paced furiously back and forth across the marble, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply, boasting loudly about how much immense capital he had supposedly dropped to secure this rental, and how he expected nothing less than total groveling subservience in return. His shrill, arrogant voice bounced off the ancient stone, ringing with the hollow, terrifying desperation of a man who subconsciously knew his entire empire was a fragile illusion. The pressure of his mounting hidden debts and the impending arrival of the billionaire investor were fracturing his composure. He kicked his suitcase violently, sending it skidding across the polished floor, where it crashed against the base of a marble pillar. He drew in a massive, ragged breath to scream for the manager one more time, his face twisted in an ugly mask of pure entitlement. I did not allow him to release that breath. I stepped deliberately out from the concealing shadows of the second-floor landing and moved directly into the warm golden light streaming through the massive cathedral window. I looked down at the pathetic, chaotic scene unfolding in my pristine, grand foyer. I took a slow, highly deliberate sip of the vintage Bordeaux, savoring the rich, complex flavor as the heavy silence stretched out. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, resonant, and entirely unyielding authority. The perfect acoustics of the grand staircase carried every single syllable down to the floor below with the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute power. I told Bradley to close his mouth. stop his pathetic tantrum and lower his voice immediately. I informed him with icy surgical precision that he was standing inside a highly respectable house and I would not tolerate his abrasive childish shouting echoing through my halls for another single second. The effect was instantaneous, brutal, and absolute. The loud, obnoxious complaints of his parents died instantly in their throats. Jocelyn gasped sharply, taking a sudden, terrified step backward as she recognized the cadence of my voice. Bradley froze completely solid. The aggressive, entitled sneer vanished from his face in a microsecond, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He slowly tilted his head upward, his eyes frantically tracking the sound of the command to the top of the grand marble staircase. He expected to see a subservient, terrified French property manager rushing down to desperately apologize. Instead, his eyes locked directly onto mine. He saw the man he had left behind in a dusty suburban annex just hours ago. He saw the supposedly destitute, ignorant father-in-law he firmly believed he had successfully outsmarted, robbed, and ruined. But I was not wearing the faded flannel shirt or the scuffed work boots he so thoroughly despised. I stood towering above him, wearing a bespoke, incredibly expensive charcoal suit that radiated pure, untouchable corporate dominance. I held a crystal glass of wine with the relaxed, effortless grace of a man who owned the very ground beneath their feet. Bradley's jaw dropped open. His hands began to tremble violently at his sides, the color completely draining from his face. The fragile illusion of his immense power shattered completely against the unyielding stone walls of my estate. The devastating collision between his desperate arrogance and my absolute reality had finally occurred, and he was entirely paralyzed by the impact. The absolute paralysis gripping Bradley lasted for only a few agonizing seconds. His fragile, deeply narcissistic ego simply could not process the visual data his eyes were transmitting. The human brain, when confronted with a reality that completely destroys its foundational worldview, will often violently reject the truth to protect itself from total psychological collapse. I watched from the top of the grand marble staircase as Bradley's mind frantically scrambled to reconstruct his shattered illusion of dominance. The pale horror draining his face was rapidly replaced by a surging, furious shade of crimson. The tremor in his hands transformed into clenched, aggressive fists. He refused to accept that I had outmaneuvered him. Instead, he manufactured a pathetic, deeply humiliating narrative to explain my sudden materialization in the heart of the French countryside. Bradley pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, his voice cracking loudly as it echoed off the soaring stone walls. He accused me of committing severe financial theft. He screamed that I had stolen Jocelyn's emergency platinum credit card, the one she had supposedly left for me to buy cheap groceries to illegally book a discount commercial flight across the Atlantic. He yelled that I was a pathetic, obsessive stalker who could not bear to be left behind in the suburban annex while my betters enjoyed a luxury vacation. He completely ignored the reality of my immaculate, bespoke charcoal suit and the relaxed, effortless posture I maintained. He desperately clung to the image of the helpless pensioner, convincing himself that I had broken into the estate merely to beg for their attention. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the authority of a wealthy benefactor punishing a disobedient dependent, demanding to know exactly which public bus I had taken to reach the private grounds. Jocelyn immediately stepped forward to align herself with her husband's frantic delusion. The breathtaking awe she had displayed just moments ago upon entering the magnificent foyer vanished, replaced by a mask of deep, unadulterated embarrassment. She looked at me with an expression of profound disgust, treating my presence as a toxic stain on her ultimate luxury experience. She screamed at me, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of basic respect. She demanded to know how I had managed to bypass the heavily armed security team at the front gate. She accused me of sneaking through the service entrance like a common vagrant, publicly berating me for ruining the most important evening of her entire life. She aggressively waved her hands, declaring that my pathetic attempt to crash their private vacation was the final unforgivable insult, and she promised that I would be sent back to America on the very next cargo flight. She was completely, tragically unaware that the very man she was blindly defending had already legally bound her to a catastrophic mountain of fraudulent commercial debt. Bradley's parents, feeding off the chaotic, aggressive energy of their son, eagerly joined the assault. His father aggressively adjusted the lapels of his heavy tweed coat, his face twisted in a sneer of absolute superiority. He loudly declared that this was a catastrophic security breach, demanding that the property management company immediately refund their entire rental fee for allowing a filthy squatter to infiltrate the premises. His mother clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, as if my mere presence from the top of the stairs might physically soil her belongings. She looked at Jocelyn and loudly proclaimed that it was an absolute tragedy that their sophisticated family had to be legally tied to such a pathetic, desperate bloodline. She ordered Bradley to stop wasting his breath on a senile old man and instructed him to call the local French authorities immediately. She wanted me dragged out of the chateau in handcuffs, promising to press maximum criminal charges for breaking and entering. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against the barrage of pathetic insults. I did not attempt to interrupt their frantic, overlapping screams. I simply stood at the apex of the sweeping marble staircase holding my crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux and observed them with the cold, detached interest of a scientist watching parasites react to a sudden change in their environment. When they had completely exhausted their initial surge of screaming adrenaline and paused to draw a collective ragged breath, I finally moved. I took another slow, appreciative sip of the rich red wine. I lowered the glass and began my descent. I walked down the curving marble stairs with a slow, heavy, and totally unyielding cadence. The thick leather soles of my custom shoes clicked sharply against the polished stone, measuring out the remaining seconds of their false reality. I did not rush. I let the sheer oppressive weight of my physical presence press down upon them with every single step. The closer I got to the foyer floor, the more Bradley's manufactured confidence began to visibly evaporate. The loud, aggressive posture he had tried to maintain started to physically shrink. By the time I reached the bottom step, standing just a few feet away from the trespassing group, the grand foyer had fallen back into a terrified, suffocating silence. I did not address Jocelyn. I did not acknowledge the existence of Bradley's arrogant parents. I locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. He swallowed hard, a thick drop of nervous sweat suddenly appearing on his temple. I spoke in a quiet, chillingly level tone. I informed him that his pathetic performance was officially over and the time for screaming had passed. Without breaking eye contact with my terrified son-in-law, I smoothly raised my left hand and gestured toward the dark shadows of the arched corridor leading to the service wing. I spoke a single name into the echoing silence. Laurent immediately stepped out of the shadows. The impeccably dressed Parisian property manager walked across the marble floor with pristine, formal posture. He did not look at the Americans. He did not offer to carry their scuffed designer luggage. He approached my side and stood at strict attention, treating me with the profound, undeniable reverence reserved exclusively for royalty. He carried a thick, leather-bound folio stamped with an official glowing golden seal. I did not say another word. I simply gestured toward Bradley. Laurent stepped forward and extended the heavy folio. Bradley hesitated, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely grasp the leather cover. He snatched the document, his eyes darting frantically between my blank expression and the property manager. Bradley flipped the folio open, clearly expecting to find a list of strict rental violations or a demand for additional security deposits. Instead, his eyes fell upon a heavy parchment document written in formal, legally binding French, accompanied by a certified, notarized English translation. It was the absolute, irrefutable property deed for Le Château des Ombres. Bradley's eyes rapidly scanned the intricate legal text. He was desperately searching for the name of the elite international holding company he had wired his massive, fraudulent deposit to just a few hours ago. He found the bold black ink identifying the sole corporate owner of the estate. The name struck him with the devastating force of a physical execution. The holding company listed on the official French property deed was the exact identical corporate entity that Bradley had mocked for years. It was the specific, seemingly obscure financial trust that he had always arrogantly assumed held nothing more than my meager, pathetic retirement pension. The cognitive dissonance shattered Bradley's brain completely. The absolute impossibility of the situation crashed down upon him. The man he had ordered to buy generic groceries with a crumpled $50 bill was the sole shareholder of the international corporation that owned the magnificent palace he was currently standing in. Bradley looked up from the parchment, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating terror as he finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. Laurent did not give him a single second to recover. The property manager turned to face the trembling group of Americans. He squared his shoulders and spoke in a booming, perfectly articulated voice that echoed into the highest vaults of the ceiling. He formally announced to the trespassers that they were currently standing inside the private, highly secure personal residence of Monsieur Malcolm. He declared with total devastating finality that Malcolm was the sole undisputed master of the estate and their presence on his grounds was no longer tolerated. The heavy leather folio hit the marble floor with a resounding violent slap. The sharp sound broke the spell of Bradley's temporary paralysis. The sheer towering impossibility of his situation was far too massive for his fragile narcissistic ego to digest. His mind violently rejected the truth to protect itself from a total psychological collapse. He thrust a trembling finger toward Laurent, his face contorting into an ugly, flushed mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He screamed that the deed was an elaborate, pathetic forgery. He accused the property manager of conspiring with a delusional, destitute old man to extort a wealthy American tourist. Bradley frantically dug into the interior breast pocket of his designer suit jacket, his breathing ragged and shallow. He pulled out his sleek mobile phone, his thumb striking the glass screen with desperate, aggressive force. He held the glowing device out in front of him like a physical shield, attempting to ward off the crushing reality closing in around him. He loudly declared that he possessed an ironclad, digitally verified rental confirmation from one of the most exclusive high-end hospitality brokers in all of Europe. He shouted that his booking was fully paid, legally binding, and absolutely bulletproof. He promised to have Laurent immediately terminated and thrown into a French prison for participating in this brazen extortion attempt against an important corporate entity. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. I remained standing at the base of the grand staircase, maintaining an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. I simply offered a slow, graceful nod and turned my eyes to my property manager. I asked Laurent to politely explain to our uninvited guest the precise current status of that supposedly bulletproof rental confirmation. Laurent did not blink at Bradley's aggressive, spittle-flecked screaming. He stepped forward with the immaculate, chilling composure of a man who dealt exclusively in undeniable hard facts. He clasped his hands behind his back and spoke in a clear, highly enunciated tone that carried effortlessly across the vast echoing space of the grand foyer. Laurent informed Bradley that the digital confirmation he was currently waving in the air like a weapon was entirely worthless. He explained that exactly 3 hours ago, the automated European banking system had attempted to process the massive mandatory security deposit required to finalize the estate rental and unlock the front gates. Laurent looked directly into Bradley's bloodshot, panicked eyes. He stated that the primary corporate credit card Bradley had placed on file had been violently and immediately declined due to insufficient funds. Bradley opened his mouth to shout an excuse, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his pale cheek, but Laurent raised a single authoritative finger demanding absolute silence. The property manager continued his devastating financial autopsy with surgical precision. He revealed that the automated system had subsequently attempted to charge the 3 secondary backup cards listed on the booking profile. Every single one of those secondary accounts had instantly triggered severe international fraud alerts. The respective banking institutions had executed a hard, irrevocable lock on Bradley's entire financial portfolio. Laurent announced that the rental contract was automatically and legally nullified the exact second the funds completely failed to clear the international wire protocols. The heavy silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute and suffocating. The remaining color completely drained from Bradley's face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost standing in a borrowed suit. His mother gasped loudly, pressing her manicured hand tightly over her mouth in sheer horror, while his father suddenly looked extremely interested in the polished marble floor beneath his shoes. The conquering, arrogant monarchs had been instantly reduced to common penniless beggars trespassing in a palace they could never afford. I took a single deliberate step toward Bradley. The physical distance between us closed, and the sheer oppressive weight of my authority pressed down on his crumbling posture. I spoke in a quiet, unforgiving tone that left absolutely no room for negotiation. I informed him that because the rental agreement was officially void, he held absolutely no legal right to stand inside my home. I told him he was currently trespassing on private property, and I was well within my rights to have him forcibly removed, placed in handcuffs, and thrown onto the street by the armed security personnel stationed at the front gate. The word trespassing hung in the cool air, cold, sharp, and definitive. Jocelyn turned her head very slowly. She looked away from my face and locked her eyes entirely onto her husband. The breathtaking, childlike awe she had felt upon entering the chateau was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, creeping, visceral horror. She looked at the opulent, priceless tapestries, the towering crystal chandeliers, and the sweeping marble staircase that perfectly matched her late mother's sketches. She then looked back at the sweating, trembling, utterly defeated man she had married. The massive discrepancy between the immense wealth he consistently projected and the terrifying bankrupt reality Laurent had just exposed finally registered in her mind with catastrophic force. Jocelyn took a highly aggressive step toward Bradley. She did not scream. Her voice dropped into a low, dangerous whisper that vibrated with genuine, unadulterated panic. She demanded to know why his supposedly limitless corporate credit cards were declining. She reminded him, her voice rising slightly in pitch and intensity, that he had explicitly promised her this lavish European trip was fully funded by the massive, overwhelming profits from his latest commercial logistics contract. She brought up the secondary backup cards Laurent had mentioned, explicitly stating that 2 of those accounts were linked directly to her own personal credit profile. The drip-fed realization of her profound, inescapable financial exposure was beginning to take root in her mind. She demanded to know exactly what kind of severe fraud alerts the property manager was talking about, her eyes wide with the dawning terror of a woman realizing she was legally tethered to a sinking ship. Bradley completely crumbled under her intense, interrogating scrutiny. He stammered incoherently, his eyes darting wildly around the grand foyer, desperately trying to construct a viable, face-saving lie. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, sweating profusely into his expensive collar. He claimed it was simply a massive, highly inconvenient banking error. He blamed the strict, archaic European financial regulations, insisting that the massive international transfer had simply triggered a routine automated security hold. He promised Jocelyn, his voice cracking with desperation, that a single phone call to his private wealth manager back in the States would clear up the entire misunderstanding in less than 5 minutes. He swore on his life that his logistics firm was generating record-breaking profits and that this situation was nothing more than a temporary, highly embarrassing logistical glitch that he would personally rectify immediately. He opened his mouth to spin another desperate layer of deceit, aiming to pacify his furious wife and his horrified parents, but a new, distinct sound interrupted him. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of thick premium tires rolling smoothly over the pristine white gravel echoed clearly through the open oak doors of the grand foyer. The sound was fluid, powerful, and entirely different from the harsh, uneven grinding of Bradley's rented commercial transport van. Everyone in the room turned their heads in unison to look out the towering entranceway. A sleek, immaculate silver Bentley pulled to a smooth, entirely silent halt directly at the base of the wide stone front steps. The luxurious vehicle gleamed brilliantly in the late afternoon sun, serving as a rolling monument to immense, untouchable European wealth. The driver, dressed in a sharp, formal black suit, immediately stepped out and opened the rear passenger door with practiced precision. A man stepped out onto the crushed white gravel. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit him with absolute flawless precision. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and he carried himself with the relaxed, absolute confidence of a man who controlled entire global industries without breaking a sweat. It was Monsieur Dupont. The powerful, highly sought-after French investor had arrived. Bradley had spent the last 6 entire months desperately courting Dupont, begging the billionaire for the massive, critical capital injection required to save his failing logistics firm from total, unavoidable bankruptcy. Bradley had orchestrated this entire opulent vacation, renting a historic chateau he could not actually afford, specifically to host a lavish, highly curated dinner designed to trick Dupont into believing his company was highly successful and overflowing with liquid assets. Dupont stood at the bottom of the stone steps, casually buttoning his suit jacket. He looked up at the towering, magnificent facade of Le Château des Ombres with a polite, highly appreciative smile. He had arrived exactly on time for the grand dinner Bradley had so desperately arranged to secure his financial salvation. The ultimate final catalyst for Bradley's total, unavoidable destruction had officially arrived at the absolute worst possible moment. The silver Bentley idling on the crushed gravel operated like a defibrillator on Bradley's failing heart. The absolute terror of his rejected credit cards and the crushing reality of my ownership were violently shoved aside by his primal instinct to survive. He was a drowning man, and Monsieur Dupont was the final gleaming lifeboat floating just out of reach. I watched from my position in the grand foyer as Bradley's mind executed a sickeningly desperate pivot. He wiped the heavy sheen of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He aggressively yanked at the lapels of his designer jacket, attempting to force the wrinkled fabric back into a shape of authority. He plastered a wide, completely manic smile across his pale face, forming a grotesque mask of manufactured confidence. He physically pushed past his horrified silent parents, marching toward the massive oak doors with the exaggerated heavy strides of a conquering king welcoming a visiting dignitary. He was going to attempt to play the game one final time right on the precipice of his own destruction. Bradley stepped out onto the wide stone landing, projecting his voice across the evening air with a loud, jovial boom that sounded horribly thin and hollow. He extended his right hand toward the French billionaire, greeting Monsieur Dupont with overwhelming forced enthusiasm. He launched immediately into his meticulously rehearsed script, a desperate monologue designed to secure the massive capital injection he needed to survive the week. He spread his arms wide, gesturing expansively toward the towering illuminated facade of Le Château des Ombres. He proudly proclaimed that he had specifically secured this magnificent historic estate to demonstrate the immense, unshakable financial stability of his logistics empire. He babbled rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in his rush to impress. He claimed that the sheer opulence of the villa perfectly mirrored his refined European taste and his unparalleled corporate success. Bradley leaned in slightly, adopting the conspiratorial tone of a fellow titan of industry. He assured Dupont that a man of true wealth understands the necessity of operating from a position of absolute strength, stating that this lavish vacation was merely a reflection of his company's record-breaking quarterly profits. He invited the investor to step inside his rented domain, promising an exclusive, highly curated culinary experience that would solidify their incredibly lucrative future partnership. He stood there on the stone steps, his hands still suspended in the air, waiting for the validation that would rescue him from the abyss. Monsieur Dupont did not take the offered hand. He stopped at the bottom of the stone steps, his tailored navy suit cutting a sharp line against the pale gravel. He looked down at Bradley's extended palm with an expression of mild, detached disgust, as if he were inspecting a piece of refuse that had washed up on a pristine beach. He did not offer a polite greeting in return. He did not acknowledge the desperate, sweating man standing in front of him. Instead, the powerful French investor lifted his gaze. His sharp, intelligent eyes bypassed Bradley, completely tracing a path up the wide stone steps through the towering oak double doors and directly into the heart of the illuminated grand foyer. His eyes locked onto mine. The aristocratic coldness that defined Monsieur Dupont's public persona vanished in a single instant. His austere expression broke into a massive, genuine smile of pure delight. Without saying a single word to Bradley, Dupont stepped forward. He walked directly past my son-in-law, brushing his shoulder against Bradley's suspended arm, completely ignoring the younger man's existence. Dupont climbed the stone steps with rapid, joyful energy, crossing the brass threshold into my home. He walked straight toward me, his arms open wide. I stepped away from the base of the marble staircase to meet him halfway across the polished floor. We embraced warmly, sharing the firm, familiar clasp of two men who had navigated the treacherous waters of international finance together for over 3 decades. Dupont pulled back, gripping my shoulders firmly, his eyes shining with profound respect. He addressed me with deep affection, his rich voice echoing beautifully in the quiet foyer. He called me his oldest, most astute business partner in the entire European acquisition market. He loudly praised the flawless condition of the chateau, marveling at how perfectly I had preserved Camille's final architectural masterpiece. He spoke of our shared history, casually referencing multi-million-dollar corporate mergers and complex global syndicates we had successfully orchestrated together while Bradley was still learning to tie his own shoes. Dupont's words were not merely friendly greetings. They were heavy, ironclad stamps of validation, definitively establishing my absolute supremacy in the room. He spoke to me as an equal, a fellow king standing inside his own fortified castle. The entire foyer held its breath. Bradley remained frozen on the exterior landing, his hand slowly dropping to his side, his face contorted in a mask of absolute, uncomprehending horror. Jocelyn let out a small strangled whimper, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the ultimate reality of my hidden empire finally crushed the last remaining fragments of her arrogant worldview. His parents shrank back against the stone walls, completely paralyzed by the display of immense, genuine power unfolding before them. They had spent the entire morning mocking a destitute pensioner, only to discover they had been insulting the architect of a vast financial syndicate. Monsieur Dupont finally released my shoulders. He slowly turned around to face the open doorway, his joyful expression hardening back into a mask of pure, unforgiving ice. He looked at Bradley, who was currently trembling violently on the stone steps. The French billionaire did not bother to address my son-in-law directly. Instead, Dupont turned his head slightly toward me, his voice dripping with absolute aristocratic disdain. He asked me a simple, incredibly devastating question. He wanted to know why a fraudulent amateur was permitted to stand on my property. Dupont did not stop there. He raised his voice just enough to ensure every single person in the grand foyer heard the fatal truth. He asked me why a desperate, completely bankrupt child, a man actively drowning in defaulted loans and facing multiple imminent federal lawsuits in the United States, was currently polluting the pristine entrance of my private residence. He stated that his wealth management team had run a routine standard background check on Bradley's logistics firm the moment the dinner invitation was extended. The forensic audit had instantly revealed the chaotic, toxic web of Bradley's financial crimes. DuPont declared that the man standing on the porch possessed absolutely zero liquid assets, zero corporate value, and zero professional integrity. The billionaire investor shook his head in disgust, asking me why I had allowed such a pathetic, thoroughly ruined creature to cross the threshold of Le Château des Ombres. The final pillar of Bradley's manufactured life collapsed, burying him completely beneath the weight of his own deceit. Bradley stood absolutely rooted to the pristine marble floor, his lungs seemingly unable to draw in the cool evening air. The devastating verbal blow delivered by the French billionaire effectively severed his connection to reality. His jaw hung slack, and the arrogant, aggressive posture he had carried into the chateau dissolved into a pathetic slump. He was entirely paralyzed, trapped in a silent void, where his carefully constructed universe had just violently imploded. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was suffocating, broken only by the soft, ragged sound of Jocelyn drawing a trembling breath. She stepped away from her husband, creating a deliberate physical distance between them. The childlike awe she had displayed upon entering the magnificent estate was completely eradicated. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate need for an explanation that would make the nightmare disappear. She looked past Bradley, turning her terrified gaze toward Monsieur DuPont, and then slowly up toward me. Her voice shook violently when she finally spoke. She demanded to know exactly what lawsuits DuPont was referencing. She asked what federal fraud had been discovered, her tone begging for someone to tell her this was simply a cruel, elaborate misunderstanding. I did not offer her immediate comfort. I allowed the heavy, crushing weight of the unknown to press down upon her shoulders for a few deliberate seconds. I turned away from the sweeping staircase and walked with measured, unhurried steps toward an antique mahogany side table, resting beneath a towering gilded mirror. The thick, reinforced leather briefcase Mr. Gallagher had handed to me hours ago sat exactly where I had placed it. I released the polished brass latches. The sharp metallic snap echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous foyer, making Bradley's mother flinch violently. I lifted the heavy leather lid and reached inside. I withdrew the massive black-bound financial dossier. The sheer physical weight of the document felt appropriate given the concentrated ruin it contained. I closed the briefcase and turned back to face the group of trespassers standing in my home. I walked toward the center of the foyer, holding the black binder in both hands. I stopped just a few feet away from Jocelyn, locking my eyes directly onto hers. I told my daughter that she had spent the last 5 years of her life existing inside a hollow, brilliantly fabricated illusion. I explained in a cold and perfectly level tone that the lavish suburban house she claimed to own, the luxury European vehicles parked in the driveway, and the designer wardrobe she draped herself in had never been funded by her husband. Bradley had never generated a single dollar of legitimate commercial profit. His logistics consulting firm was a bleeding, empty shell company held together by lies and desperation. He was a spectacular failure who merely played the role of a successful tycoon while secretly drowning in an ocean of red ink and compounding interest. I watched the denial flare in Jocelyn's eyes. She shook her head rapidly, insisting that Bradley managed massive, highly lucrative commercial accounts. I cut her off instantly. I told her that the comfortable, insulated life she had enjoyed was entirely sustained by the anonymous corporate trust I legally controlled. I had quietly subsidized her arrogant existence to protect her from the harsh reality of poverty. I reminded her how she had stood in my kitchen just that morning complaining about the smell of my faded clothes and treating me like a repulsive burden, completely oblivious to the fact that my hidden wealth was the only thing keeping a roof over her head. I raised the heavy financial dossier and dropped it directly onto the polished surface of the grand marble table in the center of the room. The thick stack of paper hit the stone with a resounding, definitive thud. I opened the black cover and fanned the pages out across the smooth marble. I instructed Jocelyn to step forward and look very closely at the paperwork that defined her husband's true legacy. She approached the table with hesitant, trembling steps. She leaned over the documents, her eyes scanning the dense blocks of legal text. I reached down and isolated a thick stack of commercial loan guarantees from the center of the pile. I tapped my finger against the bright blue ink signed at the very bottom of each page. Jocelyn stared at the paper, her breathing growing incredibly fast and shallow. She saw her own signature perfectly replicated on dozens of binding high-interest legal contracts. I explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of Bradley's desperate survival tactics. I told her that her husband had not simply ruined his own financial standing in his quest for unearned power. He had systematically weaponized her identity. I revealed that Bradley had heavily leveraged her name to secure massive fraudulent commercial loans from highly dangerous, unregulated private equity firms. He had legally bound her as the primary financial guarantor for millions of dollars in toxic debt without her knowledge or consent. She was entirely legally liable for the catastrophic collapse of his empty empire. The creditors would not stop at destroying Bradley. They would relentlessly pursue her, seizing her personal assets and ensuring she faced severe federal prosecution for international bank fraud. Jocelyn let out a low, agonizing gasp of pure betrayal. The crushing realization that she was bound to an anchor pulling her into a federal penitentiary finally broke her. She looked at Bradley, the man who had secretly shackled her to a sinking ship, with an expression of profound, visceral hatred. Monsieur Dupont remained standing near the open oak doors, observing the absolute carnage with the detached, aristocratic approval of a man who appreciated a flawless corporate execution. He crossed his arms over his chest, silently watching the arrogant Americans collapse under the weight of their own manufactured deceit. The explosive revelation shattered the stunned silence gripping Bradley's parents. The arrogant facade they had worn upon entering the chateau disintegrated completely. Bradley's father shoved violently past his wife. His face flushed a dark, panicked shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at his son, his voice rising into a frantic, desperate shout that echoed terribly through the elegant room. He demanded to know the exact current status of his life savings. He yelled that he and his wife had handed Bradley the entirety of their retirement fund to manage in his supposedly elite, high-yield corporate investment portfolio. He grabbed Bradley by the shoulder of his expensive suit, shaking the younger man violently, screaming for a direct, honest answer regarding the safety of their money. Bradley could not speak. He kept his eyes squeezed tightly shut, refusing to look at his father's furious face. He simply stood there and trembled, utterly broken. I stepped back to the marble table and calmly flipped to the final section of the extensive forensic dossier. I looked at the older couple, feeling absolutely zero pity for their sudden, overwhelming distress. They had openly mocked my existence mere hours ago, and now they were begging for mercy in my foyer. I addressed Bradley's father with a voice stripped of all emotion. I informed him that there was no elite, high-yield investment portfolio. I stated clearly and definitively that their entire retirement fund was completely gone. I explained that the money had been immediately liquidated the exact moment Bradley received the transfer. He had funneled every single penny of their life savings directly to ruthless private creditors in a pathetic, terrified attempt to delay his own physical and professional destruction. The retirement fund had been vaporized to pay off the high-interest debts of a complete fraud. Bradley's mother let out a sharp, piercing wail. Her knees buckled beneath her and she collapsed directly onto the hard marble floor, her expensive designer handbag spilling its contents across the stone. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing that her years of projected superiority had culminated in absolute destitution. The father released his grip on Bradley's shoulder and stumbled backward, clutching his chest as the absolute reality of his total financial ruin took hold. The grand foyer of Le Château des Ombres fell silent once again, filled only with the devastating wreckage of an arrogant family that had finally collided with the truth. The absolute silence following the revelation of the liquidated retirement fund lasted only until the raw, paralyzing shock metabolized into pure, venomous rage. Bradley's mother did not stay weeping on the polished marble floor for long. The aristocratic, refined persona she had so desperately tried to project upon entering my home completely vaporized, instantly replaced by the feral, unhinged panic of a woman realizing her entire future had just been stolen by her own flesh and blood. She scrambled to her feet, completely ignoring the spilled contents of her designer handbag scattered across the stone tiles. Her hands formed into rigid, trembling claws. She lunged at Bradley with a sudden speed and ferocity that entirely defied her age. The sharp, violent cracking sound of her palm striking his cheek echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted grand foyer. The brutal physical blow snapped Bradley's head violently to the side, leaving a stark, blazing red handprint blossoming across his pale, sweating skin. His mother shrieked, her voice stripped of all its carefully cultivated polite polish, descending into a raw, guttural screech that tore through the quiet estate. She grabbed him tightly by the lapels of his ruined designer suit, shaking him with a frantic, terrifying strength. She screamed that they had absolutely nothing left. She demanded to know how he could strand his own parents in a foreign country without a single dollar to their names, stripped of their security and their dignity. She wept openly, wailing that their home and their peaceful retirement had been mercilessly sacrificed to feed his pathetic, delusional ego. Bradley's father did not step forward to intervene or protect his son from the assault. He remained standing frozen near the heavy oak doors, clutching his chest and staring at Bradley with a look of absolute, soul-crushing disgust, mourning the sudden and violent death of his financial safety. Bradley stumbled backward, desperately trying to physically untangle himself from his mother's frantic, clutching grip. His chest heaved as his mind violently scrambled for a viable scapegoat. A coward backed into a dark corner will always attempt to sacrifice the person standing closest to him. Bradley's terrified, bloodshot eyes darted away from his weeping parents and locked directly onto his wife. The sheer panic in his expression instantly morphed into a vicious, cornered malice. He raised a shaking finger and pointed it squarely at Jocelyn, his voice cracking with hysteria as he launched a desperate, venomous counterattack. He screamed that this entire catastrophic financial collapse was exclusively her fault. He shouted that her relentless, insatiable demands for a lavish high-society lifestyle had directly forced him to seek out those toxic commercial loans. He loudly blamed her extravagant spending habits, her endless obsession with designer clothing, and her constant suffocating need to project an image of absolute suburban perfection to her peers. He roared that he had destroyed his own logistics company and compromised his integrity solely to keep her draped in the excessive luxury she felt entirely entitled to, desperately painting himself as a tragic, devoted martyr, crucified by an ungrateful, materialistic wife. He yelled that if she had simply possessed a single shred of basic financial discipline, he would never have had to leverage her legal identity or liquidate his parents' life savings to appease the private equity sharks circling his business. Jocelyn stood completely still, absorbing the full toxic force of his cowardly deflection. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his accusation did not provoke a screaming match or a defensive denial. Instead, it produced a profound, chilling clarity that washed over her like ice water. As she stared at the red-faced, sweating man, desperately shifting the blame for his own criminal incompetence onto her shoulders, a specific, vivid memory surfaced in her mind with razor-sharp focus. She remembered sitting at the scarred wooden table in my modest suburban kitchen exactly 5 years ago, excitedly announcing her engagement to this supposedly brilliant, aggressively confident young executive. I had not celebrated. I had quietly poured a cup of black coffee, looked at the loud boasting man pacing back and forth across my worn living room carpet, and offered her a single quiet warning. I had told her that a man who feels the constant, desperate need to brag loudly about his immense wealth is usually doing so to distract everyone from the echoing sound of his empty pockets. I had warned her that true power always whispers while fragile, insecure egos are forced to scream. For 5 entire years, she had stubbornly dismissed my advice as the bitter, jealous rambling of an unambitious, outdated pensioner who could not comprehend the success of a modern corporate titan. Now standing in the opulent foyer of a majestic French chateau that I legally owned, watching her husband violently implode and turn against his own family. The devastating truth of that kitchen table warning finally crushed her. She realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that she had married a screaming, hollow illusion. The man standing before her was not a titan of industry. He was a pathetic, cornered fraud who was entirely willing to send her to a federal penitentiary and destroy his own parents just to protect his fragile, manufactured image. That terrifying realization ignited a cold, absolute fury deep within her. Jocelyn took 2 rapid, predatory steps toward Bradley. She did not raise her voice to match his hysterical screaming. She extended her right hand, her palm facing upward, and demanded in a low, dangerous whisper that he surrender his mobile phone immediately. Bradley froze his panicked eyes, darting down to the device he was clutching tightly against his chest like a physical shield. He flatly refused, stammering out a chaotic, nonsensical string of excuses regarding banking privacy, corporate security protocols, and confidential client data. He took a hasty step backward, desperately trying to hide the digital ledger that contained the irrefutable proof of his catastrophic failure. Jocelyn did not ask a second time. She lunged forward with sudden aggressive force, grabbing his wrist and twisting it downward with surprising strength. Bradley let out a sharp, pathetic yelp of surprise as she violently snatched the phone directly from his sweating grip. Her thumbs flew rapidly across the glass screen, bypassing his flimsy numerical security lock with the practiced, familiar ease of a wife who knew all of his passwords. She opened the primary banking application. The glowing digital interface instantly illuminated the absolute, undeniable truth. There were no hidden corporate reserves waiting to be cleared. There were no pending offshore wire transfers from international clients. Every single account listed on the bright screen, from the primary business ledgers to their personal joint savings and emergency credit lines, displayed a glaring, catastrophic negative balance printed in stark red ink. They were not simply broke. They were entirely buried beneath a mountain of insurmountable toxic debt that would mathematically destroy the rest of their natural lives. Monsieur Dupont observed the pathetic, vicious implosion of the American family from his relaxed position near the grand oak doors. The refined French billionaire slowly shook his head, a gesture conveying profound, absolute disgust. He did not yell to make himself heard over the sobbing. He did not need to. His quiet, inherent authority instantly commanded total silence in the room. He addressed Bradley one final time. Dupont informed the trembling, weeping man that the elite financial community in Europe was incredibly small, highly communicative, and entirely unforgiving of clumsy frauds. He declared with the heavy, inescapable finality of a high court judge delivering a life sentence that Bradley was officially and permanently blacklisted from every single legitimate banking institution, investment firm, and commercial lender across the entire European continent. Dupont promised that by sunrise tomorrow, Bradley's name and corporate entity would be flagged as a severe, high-level fraud risk on every major financial terminal from London to Geneva. The billionaire did not wait for Bradley to offer a pathetic apology or beg for a second chance. Dupont offered me a brief, highly respectful nod, turned smoothly on his heel, and walked out the door into the evening air. The heavy insulated doors of the silver Bentley clicked shut with a solid thud, and the powerful engine purred to life, carrying Bradley's final, desperate hope for salvation away down the long gravel driveway. The sound of the departing tires slowly faded into the quiet French countryside. The grand foyer was left in a state of absolute shattered ruin. Bradley dropped heavily to his knees, weeping silently, his face buried deep in his hands. His mother continued sobbing against a cold marble pillar, while his father stared blankly at the floor, trapped in a silent state of shock. Jocelyn stood completely paralyzed in the center of the room, her eyes locked onto the glowing negative numbers on the phone in her hand. I remained standing near the mahogany table, completely untouched by the chaotic misery unfolding before me. I slowly raised my left arm and calmly looked down at the face of my watch. The absolute silence that descended upon the grand foyer was profound, thick, and suffocating. The air itself felt heavy, charged with the devastating kinetic energy of Bradley's total public annihilation. I lowered my left arm, letting the immaculate cuff of my bespoke charcoal suit slide smoothly over my wrist. The subtle metallic clink of my watch strap served as a sharp, singular punctuation mark in the quiet room. The space was a pristine museum of destroyed egos, filled only with the ragged, wet breathing of Bradley's mother and the shallow, frantic panting of my son-in-law. They were utterly paralyzed, trapped like insects in the amber of their own catastrophic failure. I did not allow them the luxury of lingering in their comfortable shock. I commanded the space with the absolute, unyielding authority of a monarch addressing a band of exiled traitors. I informed them that the spectacle they had brought to my home had officially concluded. My voice was smooth, completely devoid of any shouting or heated emotion, yet it carried a lethal, icy edge that bounced sharply off the towering stone walls and 16th-century tapestries. I issued my final, non-negotiable decree. I gave Bradley Jocelyn and his weeping parents exactly 10 minutes to gather every single piece of their heavily branded designer luggage and exit my property. I stated with surgical precision that when the antique grandfather clock in the corner struck the quarter hour, anyone remaining inside the private walls of Le Château des Ombres would be treated as a hostile criminal intruder. The ultimatum struck Bradley like a physical blow, violently jolting him out of his catatonic stupor. The sheer terrifying reality of being cast out into the rural French countryside with absolutely zero financial resources triggered a frantic, pathetic surge of defensive adrenaline. He stubbornly refused to accept the absolute finality of his eviction. He took a jerky step forward, pointing a shaking, sweaty finger at my face, attempting to summon the ghost of his former corporate arrogance. He screamed that I could not legally abandon them in a foreign jurisdiction. He shouted that he was a highly respected American citizen and threatened to call the United States Embassy immediately. He promised to report me for criminal endangerment, loudly declaring that the diplomatic authorities would forcefully intervene to protect him from this unlawful, malicious eviction. He puffed out his chest, desperately hoping that the aggressive invocation of international law would somehow force me to back down and offer him a reprieve. I did not blink. I simply offered him a cold, predatory smile that completely drained the remaining blood from his face. I advised him that contacting the American embassy was an absolutely brilliant idea. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to physically shrink back toward the heavy oak doors. I reminded him with pristine articulation that the diplomatic authorities would be incredibly interested to hear from a man actively fleeing multiple federal jurisdictions. I methodically laid out the precise legal reality of his situation, leaving him nowhere to hide. I explained that forging complex commercial financial documents across international borders carries a mandatory, highly severe federal prison sentence. I detailed how leveraging his wife's legal identity to secure fraudulent capital from unregulated private equity firms constituted massive international wire fraud. I told him that if he dialed the embassy, I would personally forward the entire black dossier of his forged signatures to the ambassador, completely liquidating his remaining freedom. I assured him that Interpol would be delighted to send an armed escort to collect a fugitive fraudster directly from my driveway. Bradley's jaw snapped shut. The empty threat died instantly in his throat, replaced by the suffocating, undeniable terror of imminent incarceration. He realized he possessed absolutely no leverage, no escape route, and no safe harbor. He was entirely at my mercy, and I was offering none. I turned my head slightly and gave Laurent a single brief nod. The Parisian property manager did not hesitate. He raised his right hand and executed a sharp tactical motion toward the shadows of the exterior portico. 4 heavily armed private security guards stepped seamlessly into the light of the grand foyer. They were dressed in immaculate black tactical uniforms, their faces carved from stone. They did not shout or issue verbal commands. They simply stepped forward in perfect unison, coming to a halt just inches away from the trespassing group. The guards rested their thick, gloved hands deliberately on their duty belts, an unmistakable, silent promise of overwhelming physical force. The terrifying presence of the security team entirely broke whatever fragile resistance remained in Bradley. Total, unadulterated panic consumed him. He spun around, scrambling frantically across the polished marble floor. He grabbed the handle of his scuffed leather suitcase with trembling, slick fingers, dragging it aggressively toward the exit. He did not look back at his wife. He did not attempt to help his devastated parents. His father, pale and completely hollowed out by the vaporization of his life savings, mechanically reached down and hauled his hysterical wife to her feet. The mother wept uncontrollably, her face streaked with ruined makeup, wailing incoherent pleas to a room that offered absolutely no sympathy. The guards flanked them immediately, placing firm, inescapable hands on their shoulders. The older couple was marched ruthlessly out the heavy oak doors, their pathetic sobs echoing down the long, sweeping white gravel driveway as they were escorted toward the iron security gates, banished into the gathering twilight. Jocelyn did not immediately follow the chaotic procession. She remained standing near the brass threshold, the heavy wooden doors open to the cooling evening air. The designer travel bag hung heavily from her shoulder, anchoring her to the reality of her shattered life. She watched Bradley sprint down the driveway like a terrified animal, completely abandoning her in his desperate bid for self-preservation. She slowly turned back around to face me. The arrogant, entitled sneer she had worn for the past 5 years was entirely gone. Her face was streaked with hot flowing tears, her eyes wide with the crushing, unbearable weight of total ruin. She took a hesitant step back into the foyer. She looked at the magnificent marble staircase, the crystal chandeliers, and the sheer, untouchable power I radiated. Her voice was a broken, fragile whisper that cracked under the immense pressure of her despair. She begged me for mercy. She pleaded for just one single room, just for tonight. She stretched out a trembling hand, desperately attempting to play the ultimate emotional card she believed she still held. She sobbed, her voice echoing off the stone walls, reminding me that she was my daughter. She cried that I could not possibly throw my own little girl out into the dark with a monster who had just destroyed her entire future. She asked me to protect her, banking on the unconditional, foolish paternal love she had ruthlessly exploited for her entire adult life. I looked at the weeping woman standing in my foyer. I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes, the sudden violent realization that her actions carried permanent, devastating consequences. I did not feel a surge of pity. I did not feel the urge to rush forward and shield her from the storm she had actively helped create. I stood my ground, my posture relaxed but entirely immovable. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and slowly, definitively shook my head. I told her that she had made her choice the day she aligned herself with a parasite and proudly mocked the man who had silently built the foundation of her life. I informed her that the 10 minutes had expired. I gestured to the waiting guard who stepped forward and firmly closed the heavy oak doors, sealing her outside in the dark and securing my absolute peace. I looked directly into my daughter's tear-streaked face as she stood shivering on the brass threshold. The sheer desperation in her wide eyes was a stark contrast to the venomous arrogance she had projected just days prior in my quiet suburban kitchen. She reached out a trembling hand, her manicured fingers grasping at the empty air between us, silently begging for a sudden reversal of the consequences she had actively earned. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting paternal embrace. I maintained my perfectly rigid posture and held her panicked gaze with absolute unyielding clarity. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone that carried the devastating weight of finality. I reminded her of the cruel, dismissive speech she had delivered while packing her designer luggage the morning they left for this fraudulent vacation. I repeated the exact meticulous words she had used to justify leaving me behind in the annex. I told her that she needed a break from me, and now she finally had it. I stepped forward and firmly grasped the heavy iron handles of the massive oak double doors. Jocelyn let out a sharp, ragged gasp, stepping backward onto the crushed white gravel to avoid being struck. I pulled the heavy wooden doors together with a smooth, forceful motion. The thick oak met with a resounding, thunderous boom that echoed through the vast stone foyer, permanently severing her connection to my sanctuary. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolts one by one. The loud metallic clicking of the lock sliding into place served as the absolute final punctuation mark on our relationship. The suffocating manufactured chaos of my son-in-law and his parasitic family was entirely eradicated, replaced instantly by the pristine, echoing silence of my rightful home. I turned my back to the locked entrance and allowed a deep, cleansing breath to fill my lungs. The oppressive, toxic energy that had polluted the air since their violent arrival dissipated entirely, leaving behind the rich, historic stillness of Le Château des Ombres. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit and walked away from the foyer, moving with the relaxed, effortless grace of a man who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from his life. I crossed the intricate hand-painted tile floors and entered the grand, formal dining room. The space was a breathtaking manifestation of classical elegance, illuminated softly by the warm glow of a cascading crystal chandelier. A massive, polished mahogany dining table stretched across the center of the room, meticulously set for one. Laurent and his elite staff had executed my instructions with flawless precision. I walked to the head of the table and took my seat. The heavy velvet-lined chair offered a perfect vantage point to survey the architectural perfection that Camille had once drafted on our modest kitchen table. I unfolded the crisp linen napkin and placed it across my lap. A discreet server emerged silently from the kitchen, presenting a sequence of culinary masterpieces prepared by a private Michelin star chef I had retained specifically for this evening. I enjoyed roasted duck glazed in a rich cherry reduction, perfectly seared scallops resting on a bed of truffle risotto, and a vintage Pinot Noir that tasted of dark berries and aged oak. I ate in absolute undisturbed peace. I savored every single bite without the suffocating background noise of Bradley's empty corporate boasting or Jocelyn's shallow materialistic complaints. It was the first meal I had truly enjoyed in over 5 years, a quiet, solitary celebration of my reclaimed independence and dignity. As the server cleared the final dessert plates, a low, menacing rumble vibrated through the thick stone walls of the dining room. The oppressive heat of the late French afternoon had finally broken, giving way to a sudden, violent atmospheric shift. A massive torrential thunderstorm tore across the rural countryside. Bright, jagged flashes of lightning illuminated the tall cathedral windows, followed instantly by the deafening crack of thunder. Sheets of heavy driving rain battered the glass, turning the serene evening into a chaotic, freezing deluge. I picked up a sleek digital tablet resting on the edge of the dining table and accessed the live feed from the estate's high-definition exterior security cameras. The crisp infrared monitors displayed the unvarnished reality of the consequences I had dispensed. The long, winding private road leading away from the front gates was pitch black, illuminated only by the intermittent aggressive strikes of lightning. I watched Bradley Jocelyn and his two weeping parents struggling helplessly against the brutal elements. The torrential rain had instantly transformed the pristine dirt shoulders of the road into thick, clinging mud. Bradley was violently dragging his heavy, waterlogged leather suitcase through the muck, his expensive tailored suit entirely ruined, plastered wetly to his shivering frame. His parents stumbled behind him, clutching their designer coats around their heads in a pathetic, entirely futile attempt to shield themselves from the freezing downpour. Jocelyn walked a few paces away from her husband, her expensive travel bag sinking into the mud with every step. She was frantically waving her glowing mobile phone in the air, desperately attempting to hail a non-existent taxi on a deserted rural country road in the middle of a massive tempest. The network of high society contacts and elite travel concierges they so proudly boasted about was completely inaccessible. They were entirely stranded, stripped of their fraudulent wealth, entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the physical world. I watched the security feed with clinical detachment, observing the literal destruction of their manufactured suburban royalty. They had demanded a luxury European experience, and the universe was currently providing them with the exact level of comfort they had actually earned. The sudden sharp ringing of my private mobile phone broke my silent observation of the security monitors. I picked up the device and saw the encrypted international number flashing on the screen. It was Gallagher, my lead legal counsel and chief corporate fixer, calling directly from the United States. I swiped the screen to accept the secure connection and raised the phone to my ear, taking a final appreciative sip of my wine. Gallagher did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice was sharp, efficient, and vibrating with the distinct energy of a flawlessly executed tactical strike. He informed me that the financial trap we had meticulously set months ago had officially snapped shut on American soil. He reported that less than 20 minutes prior, a heavily armed tactical unit from the local financial crimes division, backed by federal investigators, had executed a comprehensive no-knock search warrant on Bradley's suburban corporate office. Gallagher detailed the rapid progression of the raid. The authorities had breached the glass doors of the logistics firm and immediately seized every single server, hard drive, and filing cabinet in the building. The forged commercial loan documents, the falsified asset ledgers, and the toxic private equity contracts that Bradley had arrogantly signed using Jocelyn's stolen identity had triggered an overwhelming, devastating federal response. The regulatory agencies had frozen all of Bradley's domestic accounts and issued emergency warrants for his immediate arrest on multiple counts of severe corporate fraud, identity theft, and international wire manipulation. Gallagher confirmed that the pathetic bleeding shell of Bradley's logistics empire was officially dead, dismantled entirely by the very system he had attempted to manipulate. I thanked Gallagher for his precise, flawless execution and instructed him to ensure the federal prosecutors received full access to the black dossier of evidence we had compiled. I ended the call and placed the phone gently back onto the polished mahogany table. The storm raged violently outside the reinforced glass windows, battering the desperate, shivering figures trudging through the mud while I sat comfortably in the warm, golden light of my dining room, completely untouched by the hurricane I had summoned. The freezing torrential rain stung their exposed skin like crushed glass. The heavy clay of the French countryside caked their bespoke leather shoes, transforming every single step into an agonizing, exhausting physical labor. Bradley's mother wept openly, the pathetic sound instantly swallowed by the roaring wind, while his father wheezed heavily, clutching his chest in a state of absolute terrified shock. They had spent hours trudging blindly down a desolate, unlit provincial highway, their designer luggage dragging heavily through the deep mud. The sheer physical reality of their banishment was a brutal contrast to the opulent luxury they believed was their unassailable birthright. Eventually, a grimy commercial transport driver took pity on the pathetic, shivering figures waving frantically from the flooded ditch. They huddled together in the dark, rattling cargo bed of the transport, shivering uncontrollably amidst the overwhelming stench of diesel fumes and damp livestock. The driver dumped them unceremoniously at a forgotten, decaying commercial truck stop on the deep industrial outskirts of Paris, pointing a greasy finger toward a flickering neon sign half obscured by the relentless driving downpour. The establishment was a brutal concrete monument to absolute failure. Peeling water-damaged paint hung in long, damp strips from the exterior walls, and the parking lot was a treacherous minefield of deep, oily puddles. The flickering blue neon light buzzed with a harsh, aggressive electrical hum, casting long, sickly shadows across the cracked pavement. This was the absolute bottom of the hospitality barrel, a place designed exclusively for desperate transients and illicit nocturnal transactions. Bradley marched toward the brightly lit front office, trailing thick mud and water across the stained linoleum floor. He aggressively adjusted the ruined-soaked lapels of his designer jacket, desperately attempting to summon a final shred of his former corporate intimidation to shield himself from the degrading reality of his environment. The night clerk sat securely behind a thick bolted sheet of scratched plexiglass, barely bothering to look up from a portable television set. Bradley slammed his palm heavily against the worn counter. He demanded 2 adjacent executive suites with an aggressive, entitled bark that sounded utterly absurd coming from a man dripping muddy rainwater onto the floor. The clerk stared at him with complete heavy apathy. He stated in broken, heavily accented English that the establishment did not possess suites. He informed Bradley that the price was €50 for a single standard room and payment was strictly required in advance. Bradley sneered, pulling his waterlogged leather wallet from his ruined suit jacket with shaking fingers. He extracted a platinum corporate credit card and shoved it arrogantly through the narrow transaction slot. The clerk slowly swiped the magnetic strip through the terminal. The machine immediately emitted a sharp, denying beep. Bradley's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He snatched the card back loudly, claiming a magnetic security error, and thrust a gold secondary card through the gap. The machine beeped again, displaying a hard, irrevocable decline. The sheer suffocating panic returned to Bradley's chest as he frantically cycled through every single piece of plastic in his wallet, watching in horror as each attempt met with the exact same harsh, undeniable digital rejection. The clerk sighed heavily, clearly accustomed to dealing with desperate broke patrons, and reached for the keypad to cancel the transaction entirely. Bradley's mind snapped. The primal, overwhelming terror of spending the night shivering in a flooded, freezing parking lot completely overrode his carefully maintained vanity. He frantically unclasped the heavy, gleaming luxury watch from his left wrist. It was the absolute centerpiece of his physical persona. A massive, supposedly priceless chronometer he constantly flashed in corporate boardrooms to project unquestionable dominance and immense wealth. He shoved the heavy metal timepiece forcefully under the plexiglass, demanding the clerk accept it as collateral for a week's stay, boasting loudly and desperately about its astronomical retail value. The clerk picked up the watch. He did not look impressed. He held the timepiece up to the harsh, fluorescent overhead light, tapping his fingernails sharply against the supposedly sapphire crystal. He flipped it over to inspect the casing, a cruel, mocking smirk slowly spreading across his face. He tossed the watch casually back through the slot, where it clattered disrespectfully against the hard counter. The clerk informed Bradley with brutal, piercing clarity that the sweeping mechanism was obviously battery-operated. He pointed out that the casing was incredibly light, made of cheap aluminum-painted gold, and the entire piece was a worthless, pathetic street corner counterfeit. Bradley stood frozen, the color draining entirely from his face, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. The revelation struck Jocelyn and his parents with devastating physical force. The ultimate symbol of his immense corporate success was a cheap alleyway fake purchased solely to maintain a hollow, fraudulent image that possessed absolutely zero substance. The absolute humiliation was too immense to bear. Jocelyn violently shoved her paralyzed husband aside, her eyes blazing with a mixture of raw, visceral hatred and a desperate survival instinct. She unzipped a hidden waterproof interior compartment of her ruined designer handbag. Her fingers completely bypassed the useless frozen credit cards and retrieved a single, perfectly dry €50 note. It was a fragment of emergency cash she had quietly stashed away months ago, entirely separate from Bradley's chaotic, fraudulent finances. She shoved the crisp bill through the slot, aggressively avoiding the clerk's judgmental gaze. The clerk snatched the currency, verified its authenticity under a small UV light, and wordlessly slid a heavy, rust-stained brass key across the scratched counter. They trudged silently down the exterior concrete corridor, the freezing wind howling violently around them, until they reached the designated door. Jocelyn forced the key into the stiff lock and shoved the heavy door open. The interior was a cramped, squalid nightmare. The stagnant air was thick with the suffocating stench of stale tobacco, harsh industrial bleach, and deep, creeping mildew. The peeling, water-damaged wallpaper was stained with questionable dark patches. A single sagging mattress occupied the center of the tiny space, covered in a thin, worn bedspread that offered absolutely no warmth. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to hide, and nowhere to escape the crushing reality of their new existence. Four people who had spent their entire lives projecting elite suburban superiority were now trapped together in a filthy, degrading box designed for absolute destitution. The heavy, damp door clicked shut, sealing them inside the claustrophobic nightmare. The tense, suffocating silence lasted for only a fraction of a second before the immense pressure violently exploded. Bradley's mother launched a vicious, unhinged verbal assault directly at Jocelyn. She screamed that Jocelyn's insatiable, greedy materialism and her constant, pathetic need to impress her shallow suburban friends had directly forced Bradley into taking desperate financial risks. She yelled that Jocelyn had bled her son dry, destroying his brilliant corporate future and liquidating his parents' peaceful retirement just to buy more designer garbage. Jocelyn whipped around, her face twisted in absolute feral fury. She screamed back, her voice raw and tearing through the small room. She blamed Bradley for being a weak, cowardly fraud who lacked the fundamental intelligence to actually succeed in a legitimate business. She turned her aggressive rage onto his parents, accusing them of blindly enabling his arrogance and actively participating in the delusion that he was anything more than a pathetic, screaming failure. Bradley attempted to shout over the chaotic screaming, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative, but his voice broke into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He possessed zero financial authority, zero physical power, and zero respect. He was entirely impotent. The suffocating volume of the screaming match pressed against Jocelyn's skull until she felt physically ill. The grimy walls of the squalid room were actively closing in on her. She could no longer look at the red-faced, sweating fraud she had married or the vicious, ruined people who had raised him. She physically shoved Bradley out of her path, rushed into the cramped, grimy bathroom, and violently slammed the flimsy wooden door shut behind her. She engaged the rusty slide lock, securing a tiny, miserable fraction of personal space. The sound of the vicious, tearing argument continued to rage on the other side of the thin wood, a constant, ugly reminder of her catastrophic life choices. Jocelyn leaned heavily against the stained porcelain sink, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She looked up and met her own terrified, exhausted gaze in the cracked, water-spotted mirror above the basin. Her expensive makeup was entirely washed away, revealing the raw, devastated reality underneath. The profound, undeniable truth of the warning I had given her years ago hit her again, striking the deepest core of her being. I had warned her about the loud, empty arrogance of a fraud, and she had arrogantly refused to listen. Her false pride had led her directly to this filthy freezing room. She reached into her damp coat pocket with shaking, numb fingers and pulled out her mobile phone. The battery icon glowed a dangerous, flashing red. She opened the keypad, her vision blurring heavily with fresh, hot tears. She dialed my private international number, no longer seeking to demand answers or complain about unfair treatment. Her resistance was completely, fundamentally shattered. She was finally ready to offer a total, absolute, and unconditional surrender. The vibrating hum of the mobile phone against the polished mahogany dining table broke the quiet rhythm of the evening. I had just finished reviewing the security feeds, watching the wretched procession trudge through the freezing mud. I picked up the device. The screen displayed Jocelyn's number ringing through a chaotic, unstable international connection. I allowed the phone to vibrate 3 more times, establishing a deliberate, agonizing pause before I finally swiped the screen and brought the speaker to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the frantic, shuddering breaths on the other end of the line. The absolute silence on my end forced Jocelyn to speak. When she finally did, her voice was completely unrecognizable. The sharp, entitled edge she had wielded like a weapon her entire adult life was entirely shattered. She sounded small, broken, and terrified. She spoke in a rapid, hyperventilating rush, her words tumbling over one another in a desperate bid for salvation. She abandoned every ounce of her false pride and begged me for a financial lifeline. She pleaded for a direct wire transfer, just enough money to secure a single economy flight back to the United States. She spun a frantic, delusional fantasy, promising me that if she could just get out of this filthy, freezing motel, everything would go back to normal. She swore that they would fly home, walk back through the front doors of their beautiful suburban house, and fix the catastrophic mess Bradley had created. She promised she would get a job, that Bradley would hire a lawyer to settle his corporate debts, and that they would simply reset their lives within the safe, comfortable walls of the estate they believed they owned. She begged me to restore her sanctuary. I sat in the high-backed velvet dining chair, watching the torrential rain lash against the cathedral windows of the chateau. I let her speak. I allowed her to construct this elaborate, pathetic illusion of a safe return. I let her detail every single comfort she missed about her pristine suburban life. When she finally ran out of breath, descending into quiet, ragged sobs, the silence on the line grew incredibly heavy. I spoke with absolute clinical detachment. I looked directly into the dark, rain-swept night and repeated the exact meticulous words she had used to dismiss me the morning she packed her designer luggage for this fraudulent vacation. I reminded her that she had looked me in the eye and stated she desperately needed a break from me. I told her in a voice stripped of all emotion that she finally had it. I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath on the other end of the connection, but I did not stop speaking. I methodically dismantled the comforting delusion she had just presented to me. I informed her that booking a flight back to the United States would be a monumental waste of her time because the American house she was so desperately eager to return to was no longer an option. I explained the harsh, unforgiving legal reality of her living situation. I reminded her that the luxurious, sprawling property had never belonged to Bradley. The mortgage, the property taxes, and the comprehensive maintenance had always been funded and legally controlled by the anonymous corporate trust I managed. I told her that the exact moment their commercial flight lifted off the runway bound for Paris, my legal team had executed a pre-planned directive. I had officially canceled the lease agreement that allowed them to occupy the premises. I did not leave the property vacant to await their hypothetical return. I explained that the pristine suburban estate with its manicured lawns, sweeping driveways, and custom architectural details had been irrevocably transferred. I had signed the final binding legal documentation yesterday afternoon, officially donating the entire property and its surrounding acreage to a prominent pediatric oncology charity. The house was currently being refitted to serve as a long-term recovery retreat for sick children and their families. The locks had been professionally replaced, the security codes had been wiped, and the deed was permanently held by a hospital trust. They had absolutely zero legal right to step foot on the property ever again. I listened to the stunned, suffocating silence radiating from the filthy motel bathroom. Jocelyn could not formulate a single word. Her mind was violently rejecting the absolute vaporization of her reality. I continued my unyielding assessment. I anticipated her next frantic question and answered it before she could find the breath to ask. I addressed the fate of her curated materialistic existence. I told her that her endless racks of imported designer shoes, her exorbitant jewelry collections, the custom luxury furniture Bradley had purchased to project his false wealth, and every single personal item they owned had been systematically boxed up by a rapid response moving crew. I detailed the exact current location of her entire identity. I informed her that her belongings were currently sitting in a cheap, uninsulated corrugated metal storage unit located next to a noisy industrial highway in central New Jersey. I explained that I had personally prepaid the rental fee for that specific storage unit for exactly 30 days. When that 30-day grace period expired, the facility management would place a commercial padlock on the rolling door and auction off every single piece of her luxurious life to the highest bidder to cover the outstanding balance. She possessed absolutely no home, no sanctuary, and no material safety net to return to. The pampered, insulated life she had taken for granted had been completely erased from the face of the earth. The sheer crushing magnitude of the revelation struck Jocelyn with the force of a physical execution. The phone slipped from her numb, trembling fingers. I heard the sharp plastic clatter of the device striking the grimy, cracked tiles of the motel bathroom floor. I did not hang up. I simply listened to the hollow, echoing sound of total destruction radiating from the abandoned device. Suddenly, the muffled ambient noise transmitting through the dropped phone shifted violently. The furious, venomous argument raging outside the thin bathroom door ceased. Bradley's voice erupted, but it was no longer the aggressive, whining tone of a cornered coward shifting the blame. It was a raw, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated terror. The sound of heavy, frantic fists slamming against the flimsy wooden door of the bathroom echoed sharply through the speaker. He pounded on the wood with the frantic, violent energy of a man trapped in a burning building. He screamed Jocelyn's name, his voice cracking and breaking with sheer hysteria. He roared that he had just managed to connect his laptop to the motel's unsecured wireless network. He shouted that his inbox was flooded with urgent, panicked messages from his corporate defense attorney back in the States. Bradley screamed the details of his total annihilation through the locked door. He wailed that the federal authorities had executed a massive armed raid on his corporate headquarters. The regulatory agencies had seized every single server, frozen all domestic capital, and uncovered the mountain of forged commercial loan documents he had signed using her identity. The panic in his voice reached a fever pitch as he delivered the final devastating blow. He screamed that the United States Department of Justice had officially issued a federal warrant for his immediate arrest. The diplomatic channels had been fully engaged. He roared that his passport was flagged. Interpol was actively monitoring his known aliases, and heavily armed federal agents from U.S. Customs were currently stationed at every single international arrival gate waiting for him to step off a plane. He beat his bloody knuckles against the door, crying out that the airport was no longer an escape route. It was a federal trap. He wept loudly, screaming that he could not go back, that they were completely hunted, and that their lives were permanently over. Jocelyn remained collapsed on the filthy bathroom floor, staring blankly at the cracked ceiling, trapped in a cold, rotting cell, with a wanted fugitive possessing absolutely nothing left to lose. I reached forward and calmly disconnected the call, leaving them to the dark. 2 days later, the crisp morning sun bathed the expansive stone balcony of Le Château des Ombres in a warm, golden light. I sat at a wrought iron patio table, sipping a perfectly extracted espresso, the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans mingling with the fresh scent of the French countryside. The violent storm that had washed the American parasites from my property had completely passed, leaving behind a pristine, vibrant morning. I rested my cup on the saucer and opened the thick, leather-bound forensic update that Mr. Gallagher had couriered to me overnight. The dossier detailed the precise, pathetic depths of Bradley's final days as a corporate executive. I read the meticulously documented timeline of how my son-in-law had desperately attempted to sacrifice an innocent employee to save his own skin. The report outlined that when the private equity sharks first began demanding immediate audits of his hollow logistics firm, Bradley had panicked. He had summoned a 22-year-old junior accountant into his office, a terrified recent graduate drowning in student loans. Bradley had aggressively ordered the young man to digitally authorize the transfer of toxic, heavily leveraged equity into dummy offshore accounts. When the accountant hesitated, sensing the blatant illegality of the request, Bradley had viciously threatened to terminate his employment and permanently destroy his career in the financial sector. The moment the federal investigators breached the building and froze the servers, Bradley had immediately pointed a shaking finger at that exact same junior accountant. He had frantically claimed to the authorities that the young man was a rogue embezzler who had orchestrated the entire fraud without executive oversight. Unfortunately for Bradley, cowardice always leaves a paper trail. Gallagher's elite forensic team had easily uncovered the encrypted internal emails and IP login records, proving Bradley had personally directed every single keystroke. Reading the stark evidence of his total moral bankruptcy only solidified my absolute satisfaction in watching him burn. While I enjoyed my espresso in the sun, Bradley and his shattered family were enduring a very different reality. They had spent the last 48 hours trapped in that squalid, mildew-infested motel on the grim industrial outskirts of Paris. Stripped entirely of their corporate credit lines and blocked from every international banking terminal, they had been forced to face the physical consequences of absolute destitution. Jocelyn had taken charge with the cold, feral instinct of a cornered animal. She gathered up all their ruined, mud-stained designer clothing, the waterlogged leather jackets, and the luxury silk accessories that had survived the storm. She dragged the heavy bags through the winding, grimy streets of the 18th arrondissement until she found a dimly lit, heavily fortified pawn shop. She was forced to stand at a scratched glass counter and beg a completely apathetic broker for cash. The broker had taken one look at the water damage and the desperate panic in her eyes and offered her mere pennies on the dollar. Jocelyn had swallowed her suffocating pride, aggressively haggled in broken French, and ultimately surrendered thousands of dollars worth of high-fashion garments for just a few handfuls of crumpled euros. The cash she acquired was barely enough to secure 4 seats on a severely discounted budget commercial airline. They endured a brutal, agonizing 13-hour flight back to the United States. There were no first-class lounges, no complimentary champagne, and no priority boarding. Bradley sat completely paralyzed in a cramped, rigid middle seat near the rear lavatories. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the cabin, jumping violently at every shift in engine noise. He knew exactly what was waiting for him across the Atlantic. His parents sat 2 rows ahead, weeping silently and clutching each other in a state of absolute traumatized shock. Jocelyn stared blankly at the plastic seatback in front of her, entirely dead inside. The luxurious suburban fantasy she had aggressively defended had dissolved into a suffocating metallic tube, hurtling toward a massive legal reckoning. The budget airliner finally touched down on the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The passengers erupted into the usual chaotic scramble to retrieve their overhead luggage. Bradley remained seated, his hands trembling violently on his knees. He waited until the cabin was mostly empty before forcing himself to stand. He shuffled slowly down the narrow aisle, entirely consumed by dread. As he crossed the threshold of the aircraft door and stepped onto the brightly lit jet bridge, his ultimate nightmare materialized. 4 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with the letters FBI stood in a rigid, inescapable blockade. 2 uniformed officers from United States Customs and Border Protection flanked them, their hands resting deliberately on their duty belts. The lead federal agent stepped forward, completely blocking Bradley's path. He spoke with a loud, booming authority that echoed down the enclosed tunnel. He stated Bradley's full legal name and announced that he was officially under arrest for multiple counts of massive federal wire fraud, aggravated corporate embezzlement, and international identity theft. Bradley's knees instantly buckled. He let out a high-pitched, pathetic wail, desperately attempting to scramble backward into the aircraft cabin. 2 massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbing him by the shoulders of his cheap pawn shop sweater. They slammed him forcefully against the corrugated metal wall of the jet bridge. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists rang out clearly over the shocked gasps of the remaining flight crew. Jocelyn stepped off the plane just in time to witness the total public annihilation of her husband. She stood frozen against the wall of the jet bridge, clutching a single cheap nylon duffel bag she had purchased at the terminal. She watched in absolute horror as the man who had promised her the world was dragged away in chains, sobbing uncontrollably. His face pressed against the floor as they hauled him toward the terminal exit. Hundreds of arriving passengers stopped in the glass corridors, raising their mobile phones to record the spectacular, pathetic downfall of a white-collar criminal. Bradley was shoved roughly into a waiting, secure transport elevator, disappearing forever into the federal justice system. Jocelyn emerged into the massive, echoing arrivals terminal entirely alone. Bradley's parents had scattered in a state of blind panic, desperately seeking a quiet corner to mourn the sudden violent death of their entire lineage. Jocelyn stood beneath the glowing arrival monitors. She possessed absolutely no cash, no credit cards, and no home to return to. The crushing weight of the massive legal debt Bradley had strapped to her identity threatened to collapse her lungs. She reached into her coat pocket as her mobile phone vibrated sharply. She pulled the device out and stared at the screen. It was a single, concise text message from Mr. Gallagher. It contained an address for a corporate law firm in Manhattan and a strictly mandated appointment time for the following morning. The towering glass and steel facade of Gallagher's Manhattan law firm offered absolutely no warmth or comfort. Jocelyn walked through the massive revolving doors the next morning, feeling the heavy, intimidating atmosphere of extreme corporate power pressed down upon her shoulders. She wore the only clean garments remaining in her cheap duffel bag, her face pale and completely devoid of makeup. The arrogant, entitled woman who had sneered at my modest kitchen table 5 years ago was entirely eradicated. She approached the sleek reception desk and was immediately escorted by a silent, unsmiling security detail into a massive frost-glass boardroom overlooking the gray city skyline. Gallagher sat at the head of the polished obsidian conference table. He did not stand to greet her. He did not offer her a cup of coffee or a sympathetic smile. He was a master of legal warfare, and he approached this meeting with the cold, surgical precision of a battlefield commander executing a surrender treaty. Jocelyn sank heavily into a leather chair across from him. She kept her eyes focused desperately on his face, quietly expecting him to slide a check across the table. She still harbored a tiny, pathetic shred of hope that her father had simply wanted to teach her a harsh lesson before deploying his massive wealth to rescue her from the wreckage. She believed the safety net would finally appear. Gallagher shattered that delusion instantly. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of dense legal documents. He dropped the heavy contract directly onto the glass table. The loud thud echoed sharply in the quiet room. Gallagher laced his fingers together and looked Jocelyn directly in the eye. He informed her that my instructions were absolute and completely non-negotiable. He explained that I had authorized his firm to deploy an elite, highly aggressive team of federal defense attorneys solely on her behalf. He stated that the legal team had spent the last 48 hours negotiating directly with the Department of Justice to officially sever her identity from Bradley's massive criminal enterprise. He confirmed that the federal prosecutors had agreed to grant her full immunity from the wire fraud charges, ensuring she would not spend a single day in a federal penitentiary. Jocelyn let out a ragged, shaking gasp of profound relief, a massive physical weight momentarily lifting from her chest. She reached out her hand fully expecting Gallagher to hand her the keys to a new luxury apartment to begin her recovery. Gallagher did not move. His expression hardened into a mask of pure, unyielding granite. He tapped his pen sharply against the thick legal contract resting between them. He clarified the brutal reality of her salvation. He explained that the immense legal fees required to clear her name, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars, were not a gift. They were not a paternal bailout. The money was officially structured as a highly aggressive, ironclad personal loan from my corporate trust. She was legally bound to repay every single cent. Gallagher opened the contract to the stipulations page and methodically read off the grueling terms of her survival. He informed her that she was permanently and entirely cut off from my fortune. There would be no secret offshore accounts, no emergency trust funds, and absolutely no corporate bailouts. She was mandated by the contract to immediately secure a full-time manual or blue-collar position. Gallagher strictly forbade any attempts to leverage her former high society connections for an easy corporate desk job. She was required to punch a physical time clock, exhaust her body, and earn a daily wage through actual grueling labor. He flipped to the next page outlining her new living arrangements. Gallagher had personally selected a tiny bare-bones studio apartment in a rough working-class neighborhood deep in the outer boroughs. The lease was secured under the firm's name, preventing her from upgrading or abandoning the property. He explained that 70% of her weekly wages would be automatically garnished and routed directly to the corporate trust to slowly chip away at her massive legal debt. The remaining 30% would be her sole operating budget for food, utilities, and public transportation. She would live paycheck to paycheck, counting every single penny, entirely responsible for her own survival, until she proved she genuinely understood the monumental value of a single dollar. Jocelyn stared at the thick stack of papers. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the terms washed over her, entirely suffocating her old identity. She realized there was no escape route, no manipulation tactic, and no emotional plea that could alter the reality of the boardroom. The arrogant, entitled princess had officially died on that freezing Parisian street, and the woman sitting in the leather chair was entirely broken. She looked at the expensive silver pen resting next to the signature line. She reached out with a trembling, numb hand and picked it up. She did not argue. She did not cry. She lowered her head, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed her name, fully accepting the cold, grueling reality of her new life. Exactly 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of Le Château des Ombres decisively closed on the toxic, screaming wreckage of my past. I walked through the vibrant, bustling aisles of the Marché Raspail in Paris, letting the crisp, bright morning air fill my lungs. The sharp, vibrant energy of the local vendors shouting their daily specials provided a comforting, beautifully grounded symphony. I wore a simple tweed coat and comfortable walking shoes, blending seamlessly into the working-class crowd. No one looking at me would ever suspect that I controlled a massive multinational corporate trust. They simply saw an older man taking his time to select the perfect artisanal loaf from a neighborhood boulangerie. I exchanged warm, familiar greetings in fluent French with the baker, a man who took immense genuine pride in his grueling morning labor. I handed him a few euro coins for a warm, crusty baguette, appreciating the honest, simple transaction. This was the exact rhythm of life Camille and I had always envisioned. We never wanted to be insulated by a cold, impenetrable fortress of arrogant wealth. We wanted to remain tethered to the real world, to appreciate the raw physical value of everyday existence. I carried my modest purchases to a quiet corner cafe, ordering a black espresso. I sat beneath the shade of a striped awning, watching the historic city wake up around me. I reached into my coat pocket and withdrew the thick, sealed envelope that Mr. Gallagher's private courier had delivered to my estate earlier that morning. It was the scheduled monthly update regarding the severe legal and financial fallout back in the United States. I broke the heavy wax seal and smoothed the crisp parchment across the small iron table. The report detailed the absolute final destruction of Bradley's fabricated corporate empire. The federal prosecutors had not offered him a single ounce of leniency or plea-bargained grace. Bradley had been officially sentenced to serve 7 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The presiding judge had aggressively highlighted his cowardly, pathetic attempt to frame his junior accountant, factoring his blatant lack of remorse directly into the maximum sentencing guidelines. His logistics firm was entirely liquidated, the remaining physical assets auctioned off to partially satisfy his massive list of defrauded creditors. The dossier also contained a brief clinical update on Bradley's parents, the arrogant, posturing couple who had stood in my foyer demanding to know the status of their high-yield investment portfolios, had met a perfectly fitting end. Stripped entirely of their life savings by their own son, they had been forced to rely on state assistance. Gallagher's elite team confirmed they had recently moved into a tiny, heavily subsidized assisted living facility in a bleak industrial suburb. Their days of projecting aristocratic superiority were permanently replaced by the grim, strictly regimented routine of a sterile linoleum-floored institution. They were entirely forgotten by the high society peers they had so desperately tried to impress. I read the detached paragraphs detailing their ruin and felt absolutely nothing. There was no vindictive thrill, no lingering anger. It was simply the inescapable mathematical equation of their own greed balancing itself out. Beneath Gallagher's typed legal summary lay a second, smaller envelope. It was not printed on heavy corporate cardstock. It was a simple, inexpensive paper envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Jocelyn's. For a fraction of a second, I anticipated a relapse into her former behavior. I expected a lengthy, manipulative plea for early parole from the harsh conditions of her financial exile. I opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. A small, perforated slip of paper fell from the fold and landed on the cafe table. I picked it up. It was a physical paycheck stub. The corporate header belonged to a modest, high-volume dental clinic in Queens. The net pay listed at the bottom was a meager, hard-earned sum reflecting 40 grueling hours of answering phones, scheduling appointments, and dealing directly with the abrasive public. It was the exact type of blue-collar service industry labor she had spent her entire adult life mocking. I unfolded the handwritten letter. Jocelyn did not ask for a single dollar. She did not complain about the freezing radiator in her cramped studio apartment or the exhausting daily commute on the crowded subway trains. The arrogant, entitled princess who had demanded European sports cars and designer wardrobes was completely absent from the ink on the page. She wrote with a raw, painful humility. She detailed how her feet ached at the end of the day, how she had to carefully calculate the exact cost of her groceries, and how utterly exhausted she felt falling into her cheap mattress every night. She did not ask to be rescued. Instead, she offered a profound, genuine expression of gratitude. She thanked me for locking the door that night. She thanked me for the brutal, unforgiving contract that forced her into this grueling reality. She admitted that she had been entirely blinded by an intoxicating, toxic vanity that was actively destroying her soul. She wrote that if I had not deployed my wealth to completely shatter her world, she would have morphed into a hollow, irredeemable monster. She ended the letter by stating she finally understood the monumental weight and value of the money she had once thrown away so carelessly. I carefully folded the letter and placed it along with the paycheck stub securely into my breast pocket. The sun was climbing higher over the Parisian skyline, bathing the historic streets in a bright, forgiving light. I finished my espresso, left a coin on the table, and made my way back to the train that would return me to the quiet sanctuary of the countryside. When I finally walked back through the heavy oak doors of Le Château des Ombres, the vast, echoing space did not feel empty. It felt entirely purified. I walked slowly through the immaculate halls, my footsteps providing a steady grounding rhythm against the marble tiles. I did not feel like a vindictive conqueror surveying a ruined battlefield. I felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of a dedicated gardener who had been forced to take a sharp, heavy blade to a dying tree. I had brutally pruned away the rotting, diseased branches of entitlement, greed, and manipulation. It was a violent, painful amputation, but it was the absolute only way to save the roots. Looking at Jocelyn's paycheck stub, I knew the harsh pruning had worked. New, healthy growth was finally beginning to emerge from the scarred wood. She was surviving on her own merit, slowly rebuilding her humanity from the ground up. I walked into the grand dining room and moved toward the antique crystal decanters resting on the mahogany sideboard. I poured a single measure of vintage red wine into a heavy glass. I walked toward the towering windows and looked out over the sweeping manicured gardens stretching toward the horizon. The storm had passed, the parasites were permanently excised, and the legacy I had built was entirely secure. I raised my glass to the empty sunlit room, offering a silent, deeply grateful toast to Camille's enduring memory. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the rich wine, fully embracing the absolute unbroken silence of a man who had finally reclaimed his dignity. True wealth is not measured by the accumulation of material possessions or the illusion of infinite resources. It is defined by the uncompromising strength of your personal boundaries and the absolute refusal to finance your own disrespect. Enabling toxic behavior under the guise of familial obligation only destroys the soul of the recipient, while slowly draining the provider. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer is absolute deprivation. By shattering a manufactured reality, you force a person to completely confront their own hollow reflection, giving them the singular brutal opportunity to rebuild their character from the ground. Share your thoughts on Malcolm's ultimate decision in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey of reclaimed dignity and consequences, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next compelling story. Thank you for your support.